Albert Henry DeSalvo was born in 1931 in Chelsea, Massachusetts, in one of the poorest neighborhoods outside of Boston. His childhood was shaped by violence. His father, Frank, was a man who drank heavily and lashed out unpredictably. He beat his wife, Charlotte, until she bled, sometimes forcing the children to watch as he struck her to the floor. Frank once broke all of her fingers in front of the children, and another time sold two of his own sons to a farm for work in exchange for cash, only for Charlotte to track them down and bring them back. Albert grew up in an environment where safety did not exist. Nights were filled with shouting, fists, and the heavy silence of fear afterward. As a boy, Albert wandered the streets. He developed the habits of petty theft. He stole candy, small change, and eventually bicycles. Arrests began early. Reform schools became a part of his adolescence. By his teenage years, he was already considered a chronic offender, drifting between institutions and the poor tenements of his family. In 1948, at 17 years old, he joined the United States Army, seeing it as a way out. He served in Germany, working as a military police officer for a time, and later re-enlisted. His record was not spotless. He was caught for breaking minor rules, but the military gave him structure and a sense of order that had been missing from his early years. While stationed overseas, he met Irmgard Beck, a German woman he later married. They returned to Massachusetts and had children together. Outwardly, he was now a family man, but his compulsions were not subdued. In the late 1950s, Boston police began hearing reports of a man posing as a talent scout. He knocked on women's doors with a tape measure in hand, claiming he was seeking models. He asked to take their measurements. Many women allowed him in, only to find the session turning invasive as his hands lingered on their bodies. This man became known as the measuring man. Albert DeSalvo was behind it. Soon his behavior escalated. Dressed as a repairman or maintenance worker, he entered women's apartments under false pretenses. Once inside, he bound their hands, gagged them, and assaulted them. He did not kill, but the violence was escalating. He became known to police as the Green Man because of the green work clothes he wore during these attacks. He was arrested for burglary and sexual assault multiple times, yet he managed to serve short sentences and return to the streets. In June 1962, the first murder occurred. Anna Sleezers, 55 years old, lived in a Boston apartment. On June 14th, her son came to visit and found the door locked. When he entered, he discovered her body on the bathroom floor. She had been strangled with the belt from a robe, tied tightly around her neck and left in a bow. Her apartment showed no signs of forced entry. Detectives noted the sexual nature of the staging. Boston newspapers reported the case, but did not yet see a pattern. 2 weeks later, another woman was found. Mary Mullen, 85 years old, died in her apartment. The medical examiner determined she had been strangled. She lived alone, and her death was at first considered natural until the signs of manual strangulation were made clear. In early July, within hours of each other, 2 more women were killed. Nina Nichols, 68 years old, was discovered strangled with nylon stockings in her apartment. The same day, Helen Blake, 65, was found in Lynn. She too had been strangled with her own stockings, tied in a bow. Both apartments were neat, both victims positioned deliberately. The murders continued with an unnerving rhythm. In August, Ida Erga, 75, was strangled in her apartment, her body left exposed. Days later, Jane Sullivan, 67, was found dead in her bathroom, strangled and left in degrading position. By the end of the summer, 6 elderly women were dead, all strangled, all attacked in their own apartments, all killed with their own clothing. Panic spread across Boston. Newspapers labeled the killer the Boston Strangler. Women double-locked their doors. Hardware stores sold out of chains and deadbolts. In December 1962, the pattern shifted. Sophie Clark, 20 years old, was found dead in her apartment. She was strangled with stockings, but unlike the earlier victims, she was young. This alarmed investigators. It meant the killer was not confined to one victim type. Through 1963, the murders continued. Patricia Bissett, 23, was killed in March. Beverly Simons, 23, in May. Simons had been stabbed multiple times as well as strangled, suggesting rising frenzy. Evelyn Corbin, 58, was found in September. In January 1964, Mary Sullivan, 19 years old, was killed in her apartment, strangled, and left on her bed with a scarf around her neck and a pillow placed beside her. In total, 13 women, ranging from 19 to 85 years old, were murdered between 1962 and 1964. All were strangled. Most were sexually assaulted. Most were left in deliberately staged positions. The city was paralyzed with fear. Police conducted thousands of interviews. The killer always seemed one step ahead. In late 1964, DeSalvo was arrested for a series of non-fatal sexual assaults. He confessed to breaking into women's apartments and attacking them. While being evaluated at Bridgewater State Hospital, he met another inmate, George Nasser. It was here he confessed to being the Boston Strangler. Nasser later told his attorney, who informed police. DeSalvo then gave detailed confessions to the murders. He described the apartments, the clothing, the positions of the bodies, and the sequence of events. Many of his details matched crime scenes that had never been released to the public. Despite this, DeSalvo was never tried for the murders. Prosecutors feared his confessions would not hold up without physical evidence. Instead, he was tried for the sexual assaults and sentenced to life in prison in 1967. In 1973, at the age of 42, DeSalvo was stabbed to death in his cell at Walpole State Prison. His killer was never officially identified. Decades later, in 2013, DNA analysis confirmed that DeSalvo was responsible for the murder of Mary Sullivan, linking him definitively to at least one Boston Strangler case. Next story. Ed Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. His family lived in poverty, and the household was dominated by fear and instability. His father, George Philip Gein, was a man crushed by alcoholism. He had once worked as a carpenter, later as a tanner, and occasionally did odd jobs, but he could not hold employment for long. He drank heavily, and when he drank, he became violent. He beat his wife in front of the children and lashed out at his sons. George's weakness left the family without a reliable income. The opposite presence in the house was Ed's mother, Augusta Wilhelmine Gein. She was a deeply religious woman who read scripture obsessively and spoke often about sin, damnation, and the corruption of the modern world. She despised alcohol, she despised women she considered immoral, and she insisted that her sons listen to her lectures day after day. She raised them to believe that sex was evil, that women were dirty, and that the world outside the family home was filled with temptation and sin. To Augusta, the only safe place was under her roof and under her control. Ed had an older brother, Henry, who was 5 years older. Both boys were caught between their father's drinking and their mother's control. Augusta decided that the family needed to be removed from what she called the wickedness of the city. When Ed was still a child, she moved them to a remote farmhouse on the outskirts of Plainfield, Wisconsin. The house stood isolated on a stretch of land far from neighbors. From this moment on, the Gein family lived in near total seclusion. The farmhouse had no electricity and no indoor plumbing for many years. Chores were endless. The boys worked the fields, milked cows, slaughtered animals, and carried wood. When Ed was not working, he was reading the Bible with his mother or listening to her sermons. She taught him that women were the root of sin. She told him that they lured men into corruption, that they carried disease, and that he should avoid them completely. Ed believed her. He loved his mother with a devotion that bordered on worship. At school, Ed was shy and withdrawn. He was teased for his odd mannerisms. Other children noticed that he sometimes laughed to himself for no reason, as if hearing voices or telling himself jokes. He struggled to make friends, and his mother discouraged him from trying. If she found out that he had spoken to another child, she scolded him harshly. His grades were average, and after completing the 8th grade, he left school to work full-time on the farm. In 1940, Ed's father, George, died of heart failure. He was 66 years old. With him gone, Augusta took even firmer control over the household. Henry began to resist her influence. He worried about Ed's devotion to her and complained that her teachings were unnatural. In 1944, tragedy struck. The brothers were burning brush in a field when the fire spread. Firefighters arrived and found Ed alone. He said he had lost sight of Henry. Later, they discovered Henry's body lying on the ground. The coroner reported that Henry had bruises on his head. Despite this, the death was ruled accidental, caused by smoke inhalation. No investigation was pursued. With Henry gone, Ed was left entirely alone with Augusta. In 1945, Augusta suffered a series of strokes. Ed nursed her obsessively, caring for her every need. When she finally died in December of that year, Ed was devastated. He boarded up her bedroom and the entire upstairs of the farmhouse, leaving those rooms untouched as shrines. He retreated into 2 small rooms near the kitchen, where he lived surrounded by filth and clutter. The rest of the house remained frozen in time, preserved as his mother had left it. Alone on the farm, Ed sank deeper into isolation. He survived on odd jobs around town, hunting and government subsidies. To neighbors, he seemed strange but not threatening. He babysat for local families, and children found him entertaining. Adults thought of him as peculiar, sometimes unsettling, but harmless. What no one knew was that Ed had begun visiting cemeteries at night. He read newspaper obituaries to learn when women were being buried. At night, he dug up their graves. He selected women who resembled his mother, middle-aged and stout. He brought their bodies back to the farmhouse. There, in the dim light of oil lamps, he dissected them. He skinned the corpses, tanned their hides, and used the flesh to make clothing and household objects. He fashioned masks from human faces, stretching them over frames so he could wear them. He created a vest from the skin of a torso with breasts intact. He made bowls from skulls, lampshades from skin, and belts for nipples. His goal was to create a complete suit of female skin so that he could wear it and become his mother. For years, these activities remained hidden. The farmhouse decayed, filled with rotting food, bones, and unspeakable objects. Ed continued his routines in Plainfield. He shopped at local stores, ate at diners, and quietly returned to his macabre rituals. On December 8th, 1954, Mary Hogan, a tavern owner in Pine Grove, disappeared. Her tavern was found deserted, with blood on the floor. No trace of her was found. Locals gossiped about her disappearance for years, but the case went unsolved. On November 16th, 1957, Bernice Wardens, owner of a hardware store in Plainfield, disappeared. Her son, Frank Wardens, a deputy sheriff, found bloodstains on the floor of the store and the receipt book showing that Ed Gain had been her last customer. Sheriff's deputies went to Ed's farmhouse that night. Inside a shed, they found Bernice's body. She had been shot with a rifle, decapitated, and hung upside down by her ankles. Her torso had been split open, dressed like a slaughtered deer. When they entered the house, they found a scene beyond imagination. Human skulls on the shelves, some turned into bowls. Chairs upholstered in human skin. Masks made from faces, some with lipstick applied. A box of preserved genitals. A corset made from a woman's torso. Mary Hogan's face was found stuffed into a paper bag. Bernice Warden's head was discovered in a burlap sack. Everywhere there were fragments of the dead, turned into grotesque decorations. Ed was taken into custody. He confessed calmly, describing his grave robbing and his desire to make a suit of skin. He admitted to killing Mary Hogan and Bernice Wardens. He described visiting cemeteries, digging up bodies, and taking them home. He said he entered trances driven by forces he could not control. In 1957, he was found incompetent to stand trial and committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. In 1968, he was tried for the murder of Bernice Wardens. He was found guilty but legally insane. He remained in institutions for the rest of his life. Ed Gain died in 1984 at Mendota Mental Health Institute. He was 77 years old. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery beside his family, not far from the graves he had once robbed. The farmhouse was burned down in 1958. Many believed locals set the fire to erase its memory. But Ed's crimes could not be erased. His story inspired fictional killers in books and films. In including Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. Next story. Leonard Thomas Lake was born in San Francisco in 1945. His childhood was troubled. His parents divorced when he was young, and he was raised mainly by relatives. From an early age, he displayed strange obsessions. He was fascinated by pornography, especially bondage material, and by violent fantasies. Neighbors remembered him as quiet but odd, sometimes cruel to animals, and always absorbed in his own inner world. In adolescence, he joined the Marine Corps. He served 2 tours in Vietnam during the war, working as a radar operator. His military service gave him discipline and skills, but it also deepened his isolation. After his discharge, he drifted. He married briefly, but the relationship collapsed. His wife later described him as controlling and consumed by dark fantasies. Lake grew increasingly withdrawn. In the late 1970s, he joined a survivalist community in Northern California. He talked often about nuclear war and the collapse of society. He fantasized about building a bunker where he could ride out the end of civilization. More than survival, he dreamed of keeping women captive in that bunker to serve as sexual slaves and bear children in what he called his dungeon for the apocalypse. These fantasies were written in journals he kept, along with drawings and detailed plans. Charles Cheetat was born in Hong Kong in 1960. His upbringing was harsh. His father was authoritarian, and Charles was often beaten for disobedience. From an early age, he showed signs of antisocial behavior. He stole, lied, and broke rules compulsively. At 15, he was sent to England to attend school, but within a year, he was expelled for theft. He drifted until he came to the United States, where he enlisted in the Marine Corps by using false documents. His time in the Marines was short. He was caught stealing weapons and was jailed. It was after his release that he met Leonard Lake through mutual contacts. The partnership between Ng and Lake was dangerous from the beginning. Lake was older, calculating, and obsessed with control. Ng was younger, impulsive, and eager to please. Together, they formed a pair that encouraged one another's darkest fantasies. Lake already owned a remote property in Wilseyville, California, a wooded plot with a small cabin. There he began constructing a concrete bunker. To outsiders, it seemed like a survivalist project. Inside, it was designed with hidden rooms, locked doors, and soundproof chambers. It was a place where victims could be kept, tortured, and murdered without being heard. In 1983, the pair began their crimes. Their first known murders involved a family they lured to the property. The victims included a man named Harvey Dubbs, his wife Deborah, and their baby son Sean. They disappeared without a trace. Friends and family searched, but no bodies were ever found. Investigators later linked their disappearance to Lake and Ng through personal belongings found in the cabin. The method became a pattern. Lake and Ng would lure victims, sometimes individuals, sometimes whole families, often by pretending to sell equipment or by offering work. Once the victims arrived, they were subdued at gunpoint and taken into the bunker. The men were usually killed quickly. The women were kept alive, sometimes for days, subjected to sexual assaults, torture, and humiliation, often filmed with a video camera. Over the following years, numerous victims vanished. Among them were Lonnie Bond, his girlfriend Brenda O'Connor, and their infant son, and Michael Carroll, a friend of Bond's. Neighbors grew suspicious when they noticed families moving into the cabin property and then vanishing, with Lake and Ng later driving the victims' cars or using their belongings. The bunker itself was a chamber of horrors. Police would later find restraints bolted into the walls, a hidden cell, and videotapes showing women pleading for their lives. Lake spoke on these tapes about his philosophy, that women were objects, that he had the right to control them, and that survival of the fittest justified his actions. Ng appeared in some recordings as well, participating in assaults and murders. The crimes continued until 1985, when their partnership unraveled. In June of that year, Ng was caught shoplifting a vice at a hardware store in South San Francisco. When confronted by the store's security guard, Leonard Lake intervened. Lake was arrested, and in his car police found a revolver fitted with an illegal silencer. He was taken into custody. At the station, while left alone, he swallowed cyanide pills he had hidden in his clothing. He died shortly afterward, taking many secrets with him. Ng fled the country. He went first to Canada, where he was arrested later that year after shooting a man during another shoplifting incident. He was imprisoned in Canada while U.S. authorities sought extradition. The process dragged on for years. Ng fought extradition with legal appeals, but in 1991 he was finally returned to California to stand trial. Meanwhile, investigators searched the Wilseyville property. What they found was grim. They discovered shallow graves filled with bone fragments. At least a dozen individuals were identified through dental records and remains, but many more bones were too fragmented to identify. It was estimated that Lake and Ng may have killed as many as 25 people. The trial of Charles Ng began in 1998 after years of delays. It was one of the longest and most expensive trials in California history. The evidence included the videotapes showing Ng and Lake torturing women, the remains from the property, and testimony from experts. Ng's defense argued that Lake had been the mastermind and that Ng was merely a reluctant participant. The tapes, however, showed Ng actively involved. In 1999, Ng was convicted of 11 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death. He remains on death row at San Quentin State Prison, where he continues to file appeals. The story of Leonard Lake and Charles Ng remains one of the darkest in American crime history. Their bunker in the woods became a symbol of hidden evil, a place where ordinary families vanished, never to be seen again. Their crimes showed how two men, feeding each other's obsessions, could descend into unimaginable brutality. Next story. Robert William Pickton, known as the Pig Farmer Killer, carried out one of the most chilling series of crimes in Canadian history. His case unfolded over decades, centered on a muddy farm outside Vancouver, British Columbia, where dozens of women vanished into the shadows of an isolated property filled with livestock pens, machinery, and a small slaughterhouse. The crimes came to light slowly, in fragments, until investigators uncovered a scale of death that stunned the country. Robert Pickton was born in 1949 in Port Coquitlam, a rural suburb of Vancouver. He grew up on a pig farm owned by his family. His childhood was shaped by harsh conditions and an emotionally distant environment. His mother, Louise, was known for her toughness and obsession with the pigs. She often placed the animals above the comfort of her children. Robert and his siblings were sent to school dirty and poorly dressed, which made him an outcast among classmates. He struggled academically, often appearing shy and withdrawn, and eventually dropped out of school as a teenager to work full-time on the farm. By the 1970s, Robert and his brother David inherited control of the property after their parents' deaths. They let parts of it fall into disrepair. Junk vehicles, animal waste, and piles of debris littered the land. Still, the farm became profitable in odd ways. They rented space for vehicle storage, slaughtered pigs for local buyers, and hosted wild parties in a converted building known as the Piggy Palace. These gatherings attracted bikers, sex workers, and drifters. The farm became notorious in local circles, but police rarely intervened. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, women began disappearing from Vancouver's downtown east side, a neighborhood marked by poverty, drug addiction, and sex work. The disappearances were gradual and at first went unnoticed. Many of the women lived on the margins of society, and their absences were not always reported immediately. Families pressed police for action, but investigators were slow to connect the missing persons cases into a pattern. Pickton's method was insidious. He cruised the streets of the downtown east side in his pickup truck, offering rides to women with the promise of money, drugs, or a party at his farm. Once there, the women were isolated. The property was vast, bordered by fields and woods, with only the pigs and a few outbuildings as witnesses. The exact sequence of his killings is not fully known, but investigators later pieced together fragments of how he lured, murdered, and disposed of his victims. The murders were brutal. Pickton slaughtered the women much as he slaughtered pigs, using knives, restraints, and butchering equipment. He disposed of remains in ways that made recovery difficult. Some were fed to the pigs. Some were rendered at a meat processing plant, where he sometimes took animal parts. The scale of destruction erased traces of many victims entirely. For years, families of the missing women pleaded for more thorough investigations. Activists in Vancouver criticized police for indifference, pointing out that because the victims were largely Indigenous women and sex workers, authorities were slow to act. Picton continued his pattern throughout the 1990s, his farm absorbing life after life, until the number of disappearances became impossible to ignore. The breakthrough came in 2002, when police obtained a warrant to search the farm for illegal firearms. Once inside, they uncovered far more: clothing, personal belongings, and blood traces linked to missing women were scattered around the property. Further searches revealed human remains, bones, and DNA evidence. It became clear that the farm was a graveyard. Excavations went on for months. The site was massive, and investigators brought in heavy machinery, forensic specialists, and anthropologists to sift through the soil. They discovered fragments of human bones, teeth, and blood-stained objects. The remains were so degraded and mixed with animal matter that identifying victims was painstaking. Despite these obstacles, police connected the evidence to dozens of missing women. Robert Picton was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. At first, he faced 26 charges, though evidence suggested his victim count was far higher. Some estimates placed the number at nearly 50. During interrogations, he made disturbing admissions. He told an undercover officer that he had intended to kill 50 women, but had stopped at 49 because he didn't want to hit a round number. These statements became a chilling window into his mindset. The trial of Robert Picton began in 2007. It was one of the largest and most expensive trials in Canadian history. Families of the victims filled the courtroom, seeking answers and justice. The prosecution laid out the evidence: DNA from multiple women recovered from the farm, personal items belonging to the missing, and testimony linking Picton to the disappearances. The defense argued that there was no direct proof of him committing the murders, only circumstantial evidence from a contaminated crime scene. Despite these arguments, the jury found him guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum sentence under Canadian law at the time. Charges for the remaining 20 women were stayed, though police maintained they had evidence he killed them as well. Many families were left without official convictions for their loved ones' deaths. The aftermath of the Picton case left deep scars in Canada. Public inquiries were launched into why police had ignored early warnings, why disappearances of Indigenous women had been dismissed, and how such a large number of murders could go undetected for so long. The Missing Women's Inquiry concluded that systemic bias and failures in policing contributed to the tragedy. Picton remains in prison today, his name synonymous with one of the worst serial killing cases in Canadian history. The pig farm has since been demolished, but the memory of what happened there endures. For many families, justice feels incomplete, as not all victims were officially recognized or identified. The case remains a grim reminder of vulnerability, neglect, and the darkness that can hide in plain sight. Next story: John George Hay, later remembered in Britain as the acid bath murderer, carried out a sequence of killings in the 1940s that shocked post-war England with their brutality and ingenuity. His method was simple yet horrifying. He lured victims with promises of business or friendship, murdered them, and then attempted to dissolve their remains in barrels of concentrated sulfuric acid. The crimes revealed a calculating mind, driven by greed, deception, and a complete lack of remorse. John Hay was born in 1909 in Stamford, Lincolnshire. His parents were strict members of the Plymouth Brethren, a conservative religious sect. The household was austere. Entertainment was discouraged, worldly pleasures forbidden, and Hay grew up isolated. He later described his childhood as lonely and filled with vivid religious imagery. His parents often told him that the world outside was evil. A high wall surrounded their house, and Hay claimed that he would stare at the wall for hours, imagining shapes and visions upon it. This upbringing shaped both his imagination and his desire to break free of restrictions. As a young man, Hay was bright and musically talented. He learned to play the piano and developed a polished manner. Outwardly, he seemed respectable and charming, with good social graces. Yet beneath that exterior lay a fascination with deception. He took jobs as an apprentice engineer and a salesman, but his true interest was in schemes that could bring money quickly. By the 1930s, he had been caught forging documents, including car registrations and insurance papers. For these crimes, he served prison sentences. Hay spent much of his 20s in and out of custody. Each time he was released, he returned to new schemes. He believed himself cleverer than the law, convinced that with the right plan, he could enrich himself and live comfortably. During his prison years, he studied chemistry. There he learned how sulfuric acid could break down organic material. He later claimed that this gave him the idea that he could commit murder without leaving a body behind. If there was no body, he reasoned there could be no murder charge. After his release in the early 1940s, Hay cultivated a new persona. He dressed well, presented himself as an engineer and businessman, and ingratiated himself with wealthy acquaintances. London and Surrey in wartime were chaotic places, full of shortages and black market dealings. Hay navigated this world with charm, often visiting clubs and hotels where he could meet people of means. In 1944, Hay committed his first known murder. His victim was William McSwan, a wealthy man who owned amusement arcades in London. Hay befriended McSwan and his parents, Donald and Amy. He presented himself as a trustworthy business partner. In September of that year, he lured McSwan to a basement workshop in Kensington. There he struck him on the head and killed him. Hay then placed the body in a drum, poured in concentrated sulfuric acid, and left it to dissolve. 2 days later, he returned to find only sludge, which he poured down a drain. The method worked. Encouraged, Hay turned his attention to McSwan's parents. He told them that their son had gone into hiding in Scotland to avoid military service. He gained their trust, and within months he lured them separately to his workshop. Each was killed in the same way, their bodies destroyed in acid. Hay then took control of their possessions. He forged documents to sell their properties and lived off the proceeds. For a time, Hay enjoyed the wealth he had stolen. He moved into the Onslow Court Hotel in Kensington, an upscale residence, and lived as a gentleman. He dressed elegantly, drove good cars, and entertained acquaintances. But his spending was lavish, and within a couple of years his money dwindled. He needed new victims. In 1947, Hay targeted Dr. Archibald Henderson and his wife Rose, a wealthy couple. He charmed them with his cultivated manners, pretending to share an interest in classical music and other refined pursuits. He convinced them to visit his workshop. There, he shot them both and placed their bodies into acid baths. Again, he disposed of the remains and took their valuables. He sold their house and cars, forging documents as he had done before. The pattern repeated. In 1949, Hay lured his final known victim, Mrs. Olive Durand Deacon, a wealthy widow living in the same hotel. She spoke to him about an invention she had in mind, a fingernail hardener, and Hay, claiming engineering expertise, offered to help her develop it. He invited her to his workshop in Crawley. Once inside, he shot her in the back of the neck with a revolver. He placed her body into a drum and filled it with acid. But this time his plan began to unravel. Mrs. Durand Deacon's disappearance was quickly noted by her friends at the hotel. She was known to be punctual and social, and suspicions rose when she failed to appear. Police began inquiries and soon connected her last known movements to Hay. They obtained a search warrant for his workshop. Inside, investigators found drums containing acid and sludge. In one, they discovered remains that had not fully dissolved, a set of human gallstones, part of a denture, and fragments of bone. These fragments were enough to prove that a human body had been disposed of there. Further searches uncovered personal belongings of other missing people, including clothing, papers, and jewelry. Hay was arrested and interrogated. He confessed freely, boasting of how many people he had killed. He claimed to have murdered not just the 6 confirmed victims, but several others as well, though no evidence was ever found for these additional claims. He explained calmly that he believed he could not be charged without a body. He seemed almost proud of his ingenuity. His trial took place in July 1949 at Lewis Assizes. It attracted massive public attention. Hay pleaded insanity, claiming he drank the blood of his victims and suffered from delusions. The jury, however, was unconvinced. The evidence of his calculated fraud and the remains found in the acid drums left little doubt. After a brief deliberation, the jury found him guilty of murder. On August 10, 1949, John George Hay was executed by hanging at Wandsworth Prison. He was 39 years old. The case of the acid bath murderer entered British criminal history as one of its most notorious. It revealed how charm and deception could mask extreme brutality. Hay's belief that he could escape justice by destroying bodies in acid proved false, but his crimes left an enduring impression of cold calculation in pursuit of greed. Next story, John George Hay, later remembered in Britain as the acid bath murderer, carried out a sequence of killings in the 1940s that shocked post-war England with their brutality and ingenuity. His method was simple yet horrifying. He lured victims with promises of business or friendship, murdered them, and then attempted to dissolve their remains in barrels of concentrated sulfuric acid. The crimes revealed a calculating mind, driven by greed, deception, and a complete lack of remorse. John Hay was born in 1909 in Stamford, Lincolnshire. His parents were strict members of the Plymouth Brethren, a conservative religious sect. The household was austere. Entertainment was discouraged, worldly pleasures forbidden, and Hay grew up isolated. He later described his childhood as lonely and filled with vivid religious imagery. His parents often told him that the world outside was evil. A high wall surrounded their house, and Hay claimed that he would stare at the wall for hours, imagining shapes and visions upon it. This upbringing shaped both his imagination and his desire to break free of restrictions. As a young man, Hay was bright and musically talented. He learned to play the piano and developed a polished manner. Outwardly, he seemed respectable and charming, with good social graces. Yet beneath that exterior lay a fascination with deception. He took jobs as an apprentice engineer and a salesman, but his true interest was in schemes that could bring money quickly. By the 1930s, he had been caught forging documents, including car registrations and insurance papers. For these crimes, he served prison sentences. Hay spent much of his 20s in and out of custody. Each time he was released, he returned to new schemes. He believed himself cleverer than the law, convinced that with the right plan, he could enrich himself and live comfortably. During his prison years, he studied chemistry. There he learned how sulfuric acid could break down organic material. He later claimed that this gave him the idea that he could commit murder without leaving a body behind. If there was no body, he reasoned there could be no murder charge. After his release in the early 1940s, Hay cultivated a new persona. He dressed well, presented himself as an engineer and businessman, and ingratiated himself with wealthy acquaintances. London and Surrey in wartime were chaotic places, full of shortages and black market dealings. Hay navigated this world with charm, often visiting clubs and hotels where he could meet people of means. In 1944, Hay committed his first known murder. His victim was William McSwan, a wealthy man who owned amusement arcades in London. Hay befriended McSwan and his parents, Donald and Amy. He presented himself as a trustworthy business partner. In September of that year, he lured McSwan to a basement workshop in Kensington. There he struck him on the head and killed him. Hay then placed the body in a drum, poured in concentrated sulfuric acid, and left it to dissolve. 2 days later, he returned to find only sludge, which he poured down a drain. The method worked. Encouraged, Hay turned his attention to McSwan's parents. He told them that their son had gone into hiding in Scotland to avoid military service. He gained their trust, and within months he lured them separately to his workshop. Each was killed in the same way, their bodies destroyed in acid. Hay then took control of their possessions. He forged documents to sell their properties and lived off the proceeds. For a time, Hay enjoyed the wealth he had stolen. He moved into the Onslow Court Hotel in Kensington, an upscale residence, and lived as a gentleman. He dressed elegantly, drove good cars, and entertained acquaintances. But his spending was lavish, and within a couple of years his money dwindled. He needed new victims. In 1947, Hay targeted Dr. Archibald Henderson and his wife Rose, a wealthy couple. He charmed them with his cultivated manners, pretending to share an interest in classical music and other refined pursuits. He convinced them to visit his workshop. There, he shot them both and placed their bodies into acid baths. Again, he disposed of the remains and took their valuables. He sold their house and cars, forging documents as he had done before. The pattern repeated. In 1949, Hay lured his final known victim, Mrs. Olive Durand Deacon, a wealthy widow living in the same hotel. She spoke to him about an invention she had in mind, a fingernail hardener, and Hay, claiming engineering expertise, offered to help her develop it. He invited her to his workshop in Crawley. Once inside, he shot her in the back of the neck with a revolver. He placed her body into a drum and filled it with acid. But this time his plan began to unravel. Mrs. Durand Deacon's disappearance was quickly noted by her friends at the hotel. She was known to be punctual and social, and suspicions rose when she failed to appear. Police began inquiries and soon connected her last known movements to Hay. They obtained a search warrant for his workshop. Inside, investigators found drums containing acid and sludge. In one, they discovered remains that had not fully dissolved, a set of human gallstones, part of a denture, and fragments of bone. These fragments were enough to prove that a human body had been disposed of there. Further searches uncovered personal belongings of other missing people, including clothing, papers, and jewelry. Hay was arrested and interrogated. He confessed freely, boasting of how many people he had killed. He claimed to have murdered not just the 6 confirmed victims, but several others as well, though no evidence was ever found for these additional claims. He explained calmly that he believed he could not be charged without a body. He seemed almost proud of his ingenuity. His trial took place in July 1949 at Lewes Assizes. It attracted massive public attention. Hay pleaded insanity, claiming he drank the blood of his victims and suffered from delusions. The jury, however, was unconvinced. The evidence of his calculated fraud and the remains found in the acid drums left little doubt. After a brief deliberation, the jury found him guilty of murder. On August 10, 1949, John George Hay was executed by hanging at Wandsworth Prison. He was 39 years old. The case of the acid bath murderer entered British criminal history as one of its most notorious. It revealed how charm and deception could mask extreme brutality. Hay's belief that he could escape justice by destroying bodies in acid proved false, but his crimes left an enduring impression of cold calculation in pursuit of greed. Next story. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born on October 8, 1948, in Santa Isabel, Colombia. His life began in hardship. His father, a soldier in the Colombian army, was killed before Pedro was even born. His mother, Benilda Lopez, was left to raise her children alone, working as a prostitute in the small town where they lived. The house was chaotic, loud, and full of tension. There was no structure, no safety, and no gentle hand to guide the boy as he grew. From his earliest years, Pedro learned about neglect, rejection, and violence. By the age of 8, his life took a decisive turn. His mother caught him touching one of his sisters, and instead of discipline or protection, she forced him out of the house. Alone, Pedro was abandoned to the streets of Bogota. The streets of Colombia's capital were unforgiving. He joined groups of homeless children who survived by stealing, scavenging, and fighting over scraps of food. It was during this time that he encountered the darker side of humanity again. An older man lured him into an abandoned building with promises of shelter, only to assault him. This trauma deepened the growing fracture in Lopez's young mind. As the years passed, Lopez drifted. He survived by stealing cars, joining gangs, and wandering through Colombia's cities. For a brief moment, It seemed he might find a way out. An American family took him in, offering food, shelter, and schooling. But Pedro couldn't adjust to this unfamiliar kindness. He ran away, slipping back into the life of a drifter, disconnected from stability. By the time he reached his 20s, Lopez had crossed into Peru. Here, his transformation into a predator began. He sought out young girls, mostly from indigenous communities where poverty was widespread and children were often left unattended. His victims were usually between the ages of 8 and 12. Lopez developed a method that he would repeat again and again. He would approach the child, speak kindly, gain her trust, and lure her away from the safety of her home. Once they were isolated, he assaulted them and then strangled them. He later admitted that he preferred strangulation because it allowed him to look into his victims' eyes as they died. The killings in Peru went largely unnoticed at first. The victims came from communities with little connection to police or the media. Parents reported their daughters missing, but few investigations followed. Lopez continued, confident in his ability to operate without consequence. But in one village, his pattern caught up with him. After attempting to abduct a girl, Lopez was captured by members of an indigenous community. They tied him up, beat him, and prepared to execute him. For once, it seemed his crimes would come to an end. But an American missionary working in the area intervened. She pleaded with the villagers to spare him, urging them to hand him over to the police instead. They relented, and Pedro Lopez was deported back to Colombia. That act of mercy, though well-intentioned, unleashed a far greater tragedy. Back in Colombia, Lopez resumed his crimes. He traveled constantly, drifting between Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. In Ecuador especially, children began disappearing at an alarming rate in the late 1970s. Dozens of girls vanished from markets, schools, and rural roadsides. Their disappearances were often dismissed as runaways or trafficking victims. Poor families had little power to demand answers, and the police were overwhelmed. Lopez exploited these gaps perfectly. He later admitted that at the peak of his spree, he was killing 3 children a week. In 1980, his killing spree finally began to unravel. In the city of Ambato, Ecuador, a 12-year-old girl went missing from a crowded market. Police began investigating, and suspicion eventually fell on Lopez. Witnesses had seen him loitering around the market, watching children. He was arrested while attempting another abduction. Once in custody, Lopez surprised investigators with his openness. Calmly, almost proudly, he confessed to his crimes. What horrified authorities was not just his confession, but its scale. Lopez admitted to killing more than 300 young girls across Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Investigators followed him to mass graves where he had buried dozens of victims. Shallow pits in the dry earth revealed the small remains of children, confirming at least part of his monstrous claim. Ecuadorian authorities could only charge him with 57 murders, the number they could directly link to him. In 1983, he was convicted and sentenced. But Ecuador's legal system had strict limits. At the time, the maximum prison sentence was only 16 years. Even for one of history's most prolific serial killers, the law would not allow more. Lopez served 14 years before being released in 1994 for good behavior. Instead of freedom, he was deported to Colombia, where he was immediately arrested again, this time in connection with a 1988 murder. But the system failed once more. He was declared insane and sent to a psychiatric hospital. In 1998, doctors declared him sane, and he was released on bail for just $50. After that, Pedro Lopez disappeared. His exact whereabouts remain unknown. Some reports suggest he returned to Colombia and vanished into obscurity. Others claim he may have died, though no official confirmation has ever been given. Interpol later issued a warrant for his arrest, but no new charges have ever been successfully brought against him. Pedro Lopez remains a figure of chilling notoriety. His estimated death toll of more than 300 makes him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. Yet his time behind bars was shockingly short. The combination of weak laws, missed opportunities, and systemic failures allowed him to walk free after taking countless lives. The legacy of Lopez is not just the horror of his actions, but the silence surrounding them. Many of his victims came from poor indigenous communities whose voices were rarely heard, whose grief was often ignored. Families were left without answers, their daughters gone forever, their pain buried along with the bodies in shallow graves. The story of Pedro Lopez is one of cruelty, neglect, and injustice. A boy cast out into the streets grew into a man who preyed on the most vulnerable. A system that might have stopped him failed at every step. And a killer who confessed to hundreds of murders walked free into the world once more. The monster of the Andes fades into the shadows of history, but the silence he left behind speaks loudly. His story remains one of the darkest in true crime, a grim reminder of how much can be lost when society looks away. Next story. Otis Elwood Toole was born on March 5, 1947, in Jacksonville, Florida. His childhood was steeped in poverty, abuse, and instability. From the very beginning, he lived on the margins of society, and his home was far from a safe place. His father abandoned the family when Otis was young, leaving him in the care of his mother, grandmother, and other relatives, many of whom inflicted cruelty upon him. His mother was a strict and often violent woman who dressed him in girls' clothing to humiliate him and called him names meant to break his spirit. His grandmother practiced forms of spiritualism and witchcraft, instilling in Otis a warped sense of fear and fascination with the supernatural. From a young age, Toole displayed troubling behavior. He was slow in school, struggling with both learning difficulties and epilepsy. He often had seizures and was taunted by other children for being different. By his own later accounts, he was sexually abused by multiple family members and neighbors. This environment of abuse and neglect shaped him into someone detached from normal human connections, someone who would later drift toward violence without remorse. As a teenager, Toole spent more time on the streets than at home. He began running away frequently, hitchhiking across states, surviving through odd jobs, theft, and occasional prostitution. His sexuality made him a target for more ridicule and rejection. He identified as gay, but lived in an era and place where acceptance was almost impossible. He would later claim that he was drawn to fire, fascinated by watching things burn, and soon became known in his community as a pyromaniac. Neighbors recalled how he seemed mesmerized by flames, often lingering at the scenes of small fires. It was also during his teenage years that Toole claimed to have committed his first murder. He said he killed a traveling salesman who had propositioned him, striking the man with a car and leaving him for dead. Whether this account was true is uncertain, but it was the first of many confessions Toole would later make, weaving fact and fiction together in a way that often left investigators unsure what to believe. By the 1970s, Otis Toole was a full drifter. He had no permanent home, no steady work, and no ties to keep him in one place. It was during this period that he met Henry Lee Lucas, a man whose life had followed a similarly destructive path. The two formed a partnership that would become notorious in the world of true crime. Both men had been raised in abusive households. Both had spent their lives drifting across the American South, and both claimed to share a taste for violence. Together, Lucas and Toole fed off one another's darkest impulses. They traveled across states, taking odd jobs, stealing cars, and, according to their own confessions, killing along the way. The true number of their victims has never been fully established. At various times, Lucas and Toole confessed to hundreds of murders, but many of those claims were later disproven or dismissed as fabrications. Still, authorities believe that at least some of their confessions were real, and the pair were undoubtedly responsible for a series of killings during their years together. Toole's crimes were marked by randomness and brutality. Unlike serial killers who followed a strict pattern, Toole often acted on impulse, targeting strangers he encountered while drifting. He claimed to have cannibalized some of his victims, a claim that horrified the public, though investigators could not always confirm it. His fascination with fire continued, and he admitted to setting numerous buildings ablaze simply to watch them burn. One of the most infamous cases connected to Otis Toole was the murder of 6-year-old Adam Walsh in 1981. Adam, the son of John Walsh, who later became the host of America's Most Wanted, was abducted from a Sears department store in Hollywood, Florida. His severed head was found 2 weeks later in a drainage canal. For decades, the case remained unsolved, haunting the nation. Toole eventually confessed to Adams' abduction and murder, though the evidence was inconclusive. In 2008, long after Toole's death, police officially closed the case, declaring him the killer based on his confessions and circumstantial evidence. Despite the sensational nature of his crimes, Otis Toole's life was largely one of chaos, drifting, and confinement. He spent much of his adult life in and out of prison, arrested for arson, theft, and violent crimes. His confessions were often contradictory. He would admit to murders in one breath, then recant in the next. Investigators struggled to separate truth from lies, but his name remained tied to some of the darkest chapters of late 20th century crime in America. In 1983, Toole was arrested for an unrelated arson in Jacksonville. While in custody, he confessed to several murders, some with Henry Lee Lucas and some on his own. Over time, he would be convicted of 6 killings, though he claimed responsibility for many more. Authorities suspected that he exaggerated his role in certain cases for attention, but they also believed that he was genuinely guilty of several murders for which there was no clear evidence. As the years passed, Otis Toole's health began to deteriorate. He contracted AIDS in prison and grew increasingly frail. In September 1996, he died in prison at the age of 49. At the time of his death, he was serving multiple life sentences for murder, with the official tally of his victims still uncertain. The legacy of Otis Toole is one of confusion, horror, and unanswered questions. Alongside Henry Lee Lucas, he painted himself as part of a deadly duo responsible for hundreds of killings across the United States. While many of those claims were disproven, the crimes they did commit were enough to mark them as two of the most disturbing drifters in modern history. Otis Toole's story reflects the bleak path of a life shaped by abuse, neglect, and violence. From a childhood filled with trauma, he grew into a man who inflicted trauma on others. His name remains tied to some of the most notorious unsolved murders of his time, and his partnership with Henry Lee Lucas stands as a grim reminder of how two broken lives can fuse into something darker. In the end, Toole died behind bars, his confessions still clouded in uncertainty, his true number of victims never fully known. What is certain is that he left a trail of destruction in his wake, a life spent drifting from place to place, leaving pain and fire behind him. Next story. Henry Lee Lucas was born on August 23, 1936, in the small rural community of Blacksburg, Virginia. His childhood was marked by extreme poverty, violence, and neglect. His father, Anderson Lucas, was a World War I veteran who had lost both legs in a workplace accident, leaving him dependent on others for mobility. His mother, Viola, was described as domineering, abusive, and cruel. She controlled the household with an iron hand, and young Henry bore the brunt of her harshness. Henry's earliest years were filled with trauma. His mother was a sex worker who often brought clients into their home. She forced Henry to watch, humiliating him, and sometimes dressed him in girls' clothing as punishment. Neighbors later recalled that Viola beat her son mercilessly, sometimes until he bled, and withheld affection from him. His father, unable to defend him, drowned his pain in alcohol. The family lived in a small shack without electricity, and Henry grew up without any sense of safety or warmth. By the time he reached school age, Henry was already considered different. He suffered from poor eyesight, the result of severe infection that left one eye permanently damaged. He was bullied by classmates and fell behind in his studies. A report from his youth described him as slow, unkempt, and socially isolated. By his teenage years, he was illiterate and deeply scarred by the violence of his home. At the age of 13, Henry ran away. He drifted across the American South, surviving on odd jobs, theft, and petty crime. His criminal record began early with arrests for burglary and car theft. In 1951, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison for burglary. Behind bars, he found no reform, only further detachment from the world outside. When he was released, his life spiraled further. In 1960, he committed his first known murder. During an argument with his mother, Henry snapped. Viola had constantly berated him, and that night, he attacked her. He stabbed her in the neck and left her die. It was a brutal killing, and though he initially fled, he was later arrested. For this crime, he was sentenced to serve between 20 and 40 years in prison. After only 10 years, however, he was released in 1970 due to prison overcrowding and good behavior. Freedom did not bring stability. Henry drifted again, moving through the South and Midwest, often surviving on the margins. His crimes escalated. He was arrested for attempted kidnapping and again spent time in prison. When released in 1975, he fell into the company of Otis Toole, a drifter like himself. The two men formed a grim partnership, roaming across states together, stealing cars, breaking into houses, and, according to their confessions, committing murders. Henry and Otis fed off one another's instability. They traveled with Toole's young niece, Becky Powell, who became close to Henry. In the late 1970s, Henry settled with Becky in Texas, where their relationship blurred the lines between family and intimacy. She was only a teenager, but Henry treated her as both a companion and a lover. When Becky eventually expressed a desire to return home, Henry killed her, stabbing her and disposing of her body. He later confessed to this murder, one of the few that authorities believed beyond doubt. In 1983, Henry was arrested in Texas for possession of a firearm, a violation of his parole. Once in custody, he began to talk. What followed shocked investigators and captivated the nation. Henry began confessing to murders, not just one or two, but hundreds. He calmly told police that he had killed more than 600 people across nearly every state in America. His confessions included hitchhikers, sex workers, strangers he claimed to have met in bars, and even children. Law enforcement agencies from across the country rushed to interview him, eager to close their unsolved cases. For a time, Henry became the center of a media frenzy, hailed as the most prolific serial killer in history. He was flown from state to state, questioned by police, and taken to crime scenes where he would point out details. Newspapers ran headlines of a drifter who had killed more people than anyone else in America. But over time, doubts began to grow. Henry's confessions often contradicted known facts. He claimed to be in two places hundreds of miles apart at the same time. Some murders he described involved details that were incorrect or impossible. It became clear that many of his confessions were false. Investigators realized that Henry was confessing to crimes he could not have committed. Why he did so remains debated. Some believe Henry craved attention after a lifetime of neglect. Others suggest he enjoyed the special treatment, the meals, the travel, the notoriety that came with being a supposed super killer. Police, eager to close cases, may have encouraged his stories, willingly overlooking inconsistencies. The phenomenon became known as the Lucas hoax. Despite the false confessions, Henry was still guilty of several murders. He was convicted of 11 homicides, including that of Becky Powell and an elderly woman named Kate Rich. In 1984, he was sentenced to death for the murder of an unidentified woman, later nicknamed Orange Socks for the clothing she wore when found. For years, he sat on death row in Texas. In 1998, then Governor George W. Bush commuted his death sentence to life in prison. The decision was unusual, as Bush rarely granted clemency. The commutation came after doubts were raised about Henry's confession in the Orange Socks case. While many believed Henry had killed, there was enough uncertainty in that specific case to spare his life. Henry Lee Lucas spent the remainder of his days behind bars. He died in prison on March 13, 2001, at the age of 64. The official cause was heart failure. The legacy of Henry Lee Lucas is complex. On one hand, he was undoubtedly a murderer, responsible for the deaths of several people, including his own mother, his companion Becky Powell, and others. On the other hand, his hundreds of false confessions misled investigators, closed cases prematurely, and cause enormous pain for families seeking the truth about their loved ones. His story is often cited as an example of how law enforcement can be misled by unreliable confessions, especially when combined with the pressure to solve unsolved murders. His life reflects the tragic path of a man born into violence and neglect, who became both a real killer and a symbol of deception in the world of true crime. In the quiet of his final years, Henry faded into obscurity, but the shadow of his name lingers, remembered not only for the lives he took, but for the countless lives disrupted by his lies. Next story. Jack Unterweger was born on August 16, 1950, in Judenburg, a small town in Austria. His life began in instability. His mother, Teresa, was a barmaid who worked in difficult circumstances, and his father was an American soldier whom Jack never knew. His mother was arrested when he was just 2 years old, and Jack was sent to live with his grandfather, a man known for his drinking and violent temper. The boy grew up in a rough household where crime and abuse were never far away. From an early age, Unterweger drifted into trouble. He stole, fought, and skipped school. His teenage years were spent on the streets, stealing cars, breaking into homes, and drifting from one crime to the next. By the time he was in his 20s, he had accumulated a long criminal record for theft and assault. But beneath the surface of petty crime, darker tendencies were forming. In 1974, those tendencies erupted into murder. That year, Unterweger picked up an 18-year-old German woman named Margaret Schaefer. He assaulted her, then strangled her with her own bra. He left her body in the woods, hidden but not far from a rural road. It was a shocking crime, brutal in its intimacy. Police soon caught him, and in 1976, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. What followed seemed, at first, to be a transformation. Behind bars, Unterweger began writing. He produced poems, short stories, and eventually an autobiography titled Purgatory, or The Trip to Jail. Report of a Guilty Man, the book described his troubled childhood, his feelings of guilt, and his supposed desire for redemption. Austrian intellectuals and artists were captivated. They praised his writing as raw and authentic, a cry from a man who had changed. Campaigns began calling for his release. They argued that Unterweger was rehabilitated, that he had turned his life around through literature. Prominent figures supported him, believing his case symbolized the potential for reform in the justice system. Against the advice of prison officials who had warned that Unterweger remained manipulative and dangerous, the campaign succeeded. In 1990, after serving just 15 years, Jack Unterweger was released on parole. Freedom brought him celebrity. He became a media figure in Austria, hosting television shows, giving interviews, and writing articles. He was invited to schools and universities to speak about prison reform and rehabilitation. To the public, he was the model of a man redeemed, a former criminal who had transformed into a writer and advocate. But beneath the polished image, Unterweger had not changed. Within months of his release, women began disappearing. Most of his victims were sex workers, women who lived on the margins of society. His method was chillingly consistent. He would pick them up, assault them, and then strangle them with their own bras, just as he had done with his first known victim years earlier. The murders began in Austria, but soon stretched beyond. In 1991, Unterweger traveled to Los Angeles, supposedly on assignment as a journalist writing about crime in America. While there, several sex workers were murdered, all killed in the same manner as those in Austria. Authorities later concluded that Unterweger was responsible for these deaths as well. For months, police in Austria, Germany, and the United States investigated the series of killings. Patterns emerged and suspicions grew. Unterweger, once celebrated as a symbol of reform, was now the prime suspect in a string of brutal murders. In 1992, the evidence became overwhelming. Austrian police issued a warrant for his arrest. But Unterweger fled, traveling to France and then to the United States. He was eventually captured in Miami, Florida, by U.S. Marshals and extradited back to Austria to stand trial. His trial in 1994 was one of the most sensational in Austrian history. The courtroom was packed with journalists, victims' families, and curious spectators. Unterweger, ever the manipulator, dressed neatly, spoke calmly, and tried to charm the court. But the evidence spoke louder. Fiber analysis linked him to the crime scenes. Witnesses described his movements. The pattern of his killings, women strangled with their own bras, was undeniable. In June 1994, Jack Unterweger was convicted of 9 murders in Austria and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He faced the reality of returning to prison, this time with no hope of release. That night, in his cell, Unterweger took his own life. He fashioned a noose from the cord of his prison trousers and hanged himself, a final act of control over his fate. The legacy of Jack Unterweger is one of deception. He convinced the nation that he had reformed, gaining fame and admiration, only to use his freedom to kill again. His story is often cited as a cautionary tale of misplaced trust, a reminder that appearances can be dangerously misleading. Unterweger remains one of Austria's most notorious criminals. His life is studied not only for the brutality of his crimes, but for the way he manipulated society, blending the mask of a writer and intellectual with the reality of a predator. For the families of his victims, his celebrated release was not a story of redemption, but a failure of justice that cost lives. And so, Jack Unterweger's name lives on as the man who fooled the world, a killer who used words to disguise the truth, and whose final act closed the chapter of a life built on lies and violence. Next story. Joachim George Kroll was born on April 17, 1933, in Hindenburg, Upper Silesia, which is now part of Poland. He was the 6th child of a poor miner's family. His early life was shaped by war, poverty, and neglect. During World War II, when Joachim was still a boy, his father was drafted into the German army and taken prisoner by the Soviets. The family struggled with hunger and instability, moving frequently. Joachim grew up small, timid, and deeply isolated. He had developmental delays that left him behind other children. Teachers and neighbors noticed his limited intelligence, his awkward mannerisms, and his inability to connect. He wet the bed well into adolescence, was bullied by peers, and spent much of his time wandering alone. He was fascinated by animals, but even this interest took a dark turn. He began killing cats and other small creatures, strangling them, sometimes cutting them open to see what was inside. This early cruelty went unnoticed by adults, written off as odd behavior from a backward boy. By the time Kroll reached adulthood, his mind had settled into a pattern of loneliness, frustration, and violent fantasy. He worked menial jobs as a farmhand, a laborer, and eventually at a factory in Duisburg. Colleagues thought him strange, but harmless. He was quiet, kept to himself, and avoided conversation. But inside, he was developing urges he could not control. He was haunted by sexual frustration, unable to form relationships, and consumed by fantasies of domination and violence. In 1955, at the age of 22, those fantasies erupted into his first murder. He encountered a 19-year-old girl named Irmgard Strell in the Rhine meadows near Duisburg. He strangled her, violated her corpse, and stabbed her repeatedly. It was the beginning of a pattern that would continue for decades. Sudden attacks on unsuspecting victims, sexual assault, and often acts of mutilation. Police had no suspect and chalked the crime up as an isolated tragedy. 3 years later, in 1958, Kroll killed again. His victim was a 12-year-old girl named Clara Frieda Tesmer. She had been walking alone when Kroll lured her to a secluded spot, strangled her, and assaulted her. In a twist of tragic injustice, police wrongly accused an innocent man of the crime. He confessed under pressure, later retracting, but was still convicted and served time in prison. Kroll's ability to fade into the background meant he remained undetected. By the early 1960s, Kroll's murders became more frequent. In 1959, he killed 24-year-old Manuela Note. He strangled her and then mutilated her body with a knife, removing pieces of flesh. It was around this time that Kroll developed a disturbing habit that earned him the title that would terrify Germany years later, the Ruhr Cannibal. After killing, He sometimes cut pieces of flesh from his victims and took them home. He would cook the flesh, mixing it with potatoes or stew. Later, he told police that he did this not because of a ritual, but because meat was expensive. In 1962, he murdered 12-year-old Petra Gysi. He strangled her and then mutilated her corpse. Police once again had no leads. In 1965, he killed 25-year-old Monica Taffel. The investigation misfired again when another man was accused. Kroll's ability to strike at random across different towns and districts prevented detectives from linking the crimes. Between 1955 and 1976, Kroll murdered at least 14 people, though he claimed the number was higher. His victims ranged from young girls to adult women, all strangled, many mutilated. Each crime scene bore his mark: sudden violence, sexual assault, and in some cases, missing body parts later found cooked in his flat. Kroll's final crime, the one that ended his spree, came in July 1976. His last victim was 4-year-old Marion Ketter. She disappeared while playing near her home in Duisburg. A frantic search began. Neighbors noticed strange plumbing issues in their apartment block. Toilets were backing up. When police investigated, they found something horrifying. In the pipes, human remains had clogged the system. Tracing the plumbing led them directly to Joachim Kroll's apartment. Inside, detectives found a scene of horror. Pots were on the stove, containing stew mixed with human flesh. In the refrigerator were more remains. Kroll confessed immediately. He told police that he had strangled Marion, dismembered her, and attempted to flush parts of her body down the toilet. During questioning, Kroll calmly admitted to a string of murders spanning over 2 decades. He listed victims by name, describing how he had killed them and what he had done afterward. His flat, a modest, shabby space, became infamous as the home of one of Germany's worst killers. Kroll was arrested and put on trial in 1982, years after his capture. The trial lasted 151 days. Psychiatrists examined him and determined that while he was intellectually limited with the mind of a child, he knew right from wrong. The court rejected pleas of diminished responsibility. In April 1982, Joachim Kroll was found guilty of 8 murders and 1 attempted murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. In prison, he lived quietly, showing little understanding of the enormity of his crimes. Other inmates despised him, and he spent much of his time alone. In 1991, at the age of 58, Joachim Kroll died of a heart attack behind bars. His story remains one of the most chilling in German history. A man of low intelligence, seemingly harmless on the outside, who spent decades killing in silence, evading capture through randomness and luck, and horrifying the nation when his full crimes were revealed. Next story. Mark Dutroux was born on November 6, 1956, in Brussels, Belgium. He was the eldest of 5 children in a troubled household. His parents, both teachers, struggled with their own relationship, and the family atmosphere was tense, cold, and unstable. When Mark was still young, his parents divorced, and his childhood became fractured between 2 unhappy homes. From an early age, Dutroux showed signs of cruelty and manipulation. He was known to bully other children and displayed a lack of empathy that went unnoticed by those around him. As he grew older, Dutroux's behavior turned criminal. In his teenage years, he ran away from home repeatedly, stealing cars, dealing in stolen goods, and committing petty crimes. He often manipulated girls into trusting him, only to abuse that trust. By his 20s, his criminal record included theft, assault, and fraud. He married young, fathered children, and divorced just as quickly, leaving a trail of instability and neglect. In 1986, Belgian authorities finally recognized Dutroux's true danger. He was arrested for abducting and assaulting several young girls. The crimes were chilling, and he was sentenced to 13 years in prison. Yet, astonishingly, after serving only about 3 years, he was released early for good behavior. This decision would later haunt Belgium, because it freed a man who would go on to commit some of the most horrific crimes in the country's history. In the 1990s, Dutroux began building a twisted empire of abuse. He purchased several properties across Belgium, rundown houses, and hidden cellars that he converted into secret chambers. With the help of his accomplice and partner, Michelle Martin, he abducted young girls, imprisoning them in these basements. He kept them locked away for weeks, sometimes months, subjecting them to starvation, neglect, and abuse. In 1995, two 8-year-old girls, Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo, disappeared while walking home in the town of Grace Holland. Their disappearance shocked Belgium, sparking nationwide searches. But the girls had been taken by Dutrix, imprisoned in one of his cellars. When Dutrix was briefly jailed for unrelated theft later that year, he left the girls in the hidden chamber without food. By the time he returned, both children had died of starvation. Not long after, two more young girls, Marshall and Yves Lambrex, aged 17 and 19, were kidnapped while on holiday in Ostend. Their fate was the same: imprisoned, abused, and ultimately murdered. In 1996, another two victims, Sabine Dardenne, age 12, and Letitia Delhez, age 14, were abducted. But unlike the earlier girls, Sabine and Letitia survived. Their eventual rescue would break open the case. In August 1996, police searching Dutrix's home discovered Letitia alive, imprisoned in a hidden cell. Days later, they also found Sabine. Their testimony exposed the full horror of what Dutrix had done. Authorities then uncovered the bodies of Julie, Melissa, and Yves buried on his properties. The revelations horrified Belgium. Citizens were outraged not only by Dutrix's crimes, but by the failures of police and justice. Complaints had been filed against him repeatedly over the years, and yet authorities had failed to act. Worse still, many suspected that Dutrix had not acted alone, that he was part of a larger network of child exploitation, possibly protected by powerful figures. Whether or not those suspicions were true, they fueled a wave of public anger and distrust. In October 1996, 500,000 people marched through Brussels in what became known as the White March, a demonstration demanding justice, accountability, and protection for children. It was one of the largest public protests in Belgium's history, a symbol of national grief and rage. Dutrix was tried in 2004 after years of investigation and delay. The trial was enormous, lasting months, with survivors Sabine and Letitia testifying against him. The evidence left no doubt. Dutrix was convicted of kidnapping, rape, and murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. His accomplice, Michelle Martin, received 30 years, though her later early release caused new waves of public anger. In prison, Dutrix remained manipulative, claiming he was the victim of conspiracies, blaming others, and never accepting responsibility. But to the people of Belgium, his name became synonymous with betrayal and horror. The case left deep scars on the nation. It exposed the failings of the justice system, the incompetence of law enforcement, and the vulnerability of children in a society that had trusted its institutions. For the families of the victims, no sentence could undo the suffering. For the survivors, the memories of their captivity remained lifelong wounds. Marc Dutrix will forever be remembered as Belgium's most hated criminal, a man who turned his cunning into cruelty and whose crimes shattered a nation's trust. In the summer of 1969, the city of Los Angeles was simmering under the weight of change. The counterculture of the 60s had reached its peak. Young people were questioning authority, turning to new ways of life, and searching for belonging in communes and spiritual groups. Against this backdrop, a man named Charles Manson rose from obscurity to infamy. His story and the crimes carried out by the group around him would come to define the end of the 60s. The murders committed by his followers shocked not only California, but the entire world, and their echoes continue to this day. Charles Manson was born in 1934 in Cincinnati, Ohio. His mother, Kathleen Maddox, was just 16 when she gave birth to him. His father was absent from the start, and Manson's childhood was marked by instability and neglect. His mother spent time in prison, and young Charles was shuttled between relatives and institutions. By the age of 12, he was already stealing and running away from home. Reform schools became a revolving door for him, and each stay seemed to harden him further. He learned how to manipulate people and how to survive by reading others' weaknesses. By his 20s, Manson had spent more time in prison than out of it. He developed a talent for playing guitar and singing. In prison, he absorbed ideas from self-help books and religious tracts, twisting them into his own philosophy. He read about Scientology, about the power of positive thinking, and about Dale Carnegie's methods of influence. He learned how to talk in circles, to use repetition and rhythm to capture attention. When he was finally released from prison in 1967, he arrived in San Francisco at the very height of the Summer of Love. Thousands of young people had flocked to the Haight-Ashbury district, disillusioned with mainstream society and searching for meaning. Manson found in them an audience willing to listen. He began to gather followers, most of them young women. Many came from troubled homes or were searching for belonging. They were drawn in by Manson's charisma, his promises of love, freedom, and a new way of life. He offered them music, drugs, and the illusion of family. They began calling him Charlie and looking to him for guidance. Over time, this group came to be known as the Family. They traveled together, lived communally, and revolved entirely around Manson's desires. Manson's ambitions went beyond being a leader of a small group. He wanted fame as a musician. He believed his songs could change the world. Through connections, he managed to meet record producer Terry Melcher, who was the son of actress Doris Day. Manson played his music for Melcher, hoping to secure a recording contract. For a time, it seemed possible, as Melcher visited the house where the family was living. But eventually, Melcher declined to sign him. For Manson, this rejection was more than a disappointment. It became a seed of resentment and rage. By 1968, Manson had developed a strange philosophy that combined fragments of religion, music lyrics, and apocalyptic visions. He interpreted songs by the Beatles as messages directed at him. In particular, he fixated on the White Album, hearing in its songs a prophecy of a coming race war. He called this vision Helter Skelter, after the Beatles track. In his view, society was about to collapse in chaos and violence, and he and his family would emerge as the rulers of a new order. His followers accepted this vision, partly because they were under the influence of drugs, partly because of their devotion to him, and partly because they had severed ties with the outside world. The family eventually moved to Spahn Ranch, an old movie set location in the hills outside Los Angeles. The ranch was owned by George Spahn, an elderly man nearly blind. Manson convinced him to let them stay in exchange for labor and companionship. The ranch became their home base, where they lived in a haze of drugs, sex, and preparation for what they thought was an inevitable conflict. Life there was chaotic, but tightly controlled by Manson. He would hold long, rambling lectures, play music, and demand loyalty. Tensions escalated in the summer of 1969. One of Manson's close associates, Tex Watson, became deeply involved in his teachings. Watson had once been a clean-cut young man from Texas, but under Manson's sway, he transformed into one of his most devoted soldiers. Another member, Susan Atkins, had grown up in a broken home and drifted into drugs and stripping before finding the family. Patricia Krenwinkel was shy and insecure, easily manipulated by Manson. Leslie Van Houten, only 19, joined later and was drawn by promises of love and belonging. Together with others, they became the core of the family who would carry out Manson's dark commands. In July 1969, a musician named Gary Hinman was killed. Manson believed Hinman had cheated members of the family in a drug deal. Several followers, including Bobby Beausoleil, Susan Atkins, and Mary Brunner, went to Hinman's house to confront him. The confrontation turned violent. Hinman was held for days and eventually stabbed to death. On the walls of his home, the killers scrawled words in blood, including the phrase "political piggy." This was meant to make the murder look like the work of revolutionary groups. It was the beginning of the family's violent campaign. A few weeks later, Manson decided to escalate. On the night of August 8th, 1969, he instructed Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian to go to a house in Benedict Canyon. This house had once been rented by Terry Melcher, the producer who had rejected Manson. By that summer, it was occupied by actress Sharon Tate, the wife of director Roman Polanski, who was away in Europe. Sharon Tate was 8.5 months pregnant. She was staying with friends Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and Wojciech Frykowski. That night they became targets not for who they were, but for where they lived. The killers entered the property late at night. What followed was a night of unspeakable violence. Jay Sebring was shot and stabbed. Abigail Folger tried to escape, but was chased down and killed. Wojciech Frykowski fought desperately, but was overpowered. Sharon Tate, pleading for the life of her unborn child, was brutally murdered. Before leaving, the killers wrote the word pig on the front door in blood. The next night, Manson himself joined the group as they set out again. This time their targets were Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, a wealthy couple who lived in Los Feliz. Manson tied them up and then left, ordering his followers to finish the job. The LaBiancas were stabbed dozens of times. Words like death to pigs and helter skelter were scrawled on the walls. The murders terrified Los Angeles. Wealthy neighborhoods were gripped with fear. Newspapers carried lurid headlines about ritualistic killings and satanic cults. At first, the police struggled to connect the dots. The Tate murders and the LaBianca murders were investigated separately. Rumors swirled, and Hollywood was on edge. It was only later, through the arrest of Susan Atkins on unrelated charges, that the truth began to surface. While in jail, Atkins spoke to fellow inmates and bragged about the murders. Word reached the authorities, who began to piece together the story. Detectives soon realized that a commune at Spawn Ranch was at the center of it all. A raid on the ranch uncovered weapons, stolen cars, and evidence linking members to the crimes. As the investigation tightened, members of the family were arrested. Charles Manson was taken into custody along with Watson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten. The trial that followed became one of the most notorious in American history. The prosecution was led by Vincent Bugliosi, who faced the challenge of proving that Manson himself had orchestrated the murders, even though he had not wielded the knife in most cases. Bugliosi argued that Manson's control over his followers was so complete that his words were as deadly as any weapon. The prosecution presented testimony from family members who had turned against Manson, including Linda Kasabian, who described the nights of the murders in chilling detail. The defense attempted to portray Manson as a scapegoat, and at times the courtroom descended into chaos. Manson carved an X into his forehead, later turning it into a swastika. His followers in the gallery mimicked his gestures, shaved their heads, and chanted in unison. The trial became a media circus, a grim spectacle that mirrored the madness of the crimes themselves. In 1971, Manson and his co-defendants were found guilty. They were sentenced to death. The sentences were later commuted to life in prison after California temporarily abolished the death penalty. Manson spent the rest of his life in prison, continuing to attract attention, interviews, and even admirers. He never expressed remorse. Susan Atkins died in prison in 2009. Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten remain incarcerated to this day, though Van Houten was recently granted parole after decades behind bars. Tex Watson also remains in prison. The impact of the Manson murders went far beyond the courtroom. For many Americans, the killings marked the end of the 60s, shattering the image of peace and love. The randomness of the victims, the brutality of the crimes, and the bizarre philosophy behind them left scars on the cultural landscape. Sharon Tate, remembered for her beauty and promise, became a symbol of lives cut short by senseless violence. In the years that followed, countless books, films, and documentaries would revisit the case. Each attempt tried to make sense of how a drifter like Manson could hold such sway over others, and how ordinary young people could commit acts of such cruelty. The story continues to fascinate and horrify, a reminder of the darkness that can grow in the shadows of charisma and manipulation. And so the tale of Charles Manson and the family remains one of the most infamous true crime stories in history. It is a story that begins with a broken child in Ohio and ends with blood on the walls of Hollywood mansions. It is a story of manipulation, delusion, and murder. It is also a story of how fragile society can feel when violence erupts without reason. Long after the headlines have faded, The echo of those summer nights in 1969 still lingers, reminding us of the depths human beings can fall into when guided by obsession and fear. Next story. Aileen Carol Pittman was born on February 29th of 1956 in Rochester, Michigan. From the moment of her birth, her life was marked by instability and hardship. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a convicted sex offender who was imprisoned at the time of her birth. He later died by suicide in prison. Her mother, Diane Wernos, was only a teenager when Aileen was born. By the time Aileen was 4 years old, her mother abandoned her and her older brother Keith, leaving them to be raised by their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wernos. Life with her grandparents was far from safe or loving. Her grandmother struggled with alcoholism, and her grandfather was a violent man with a heavy hand. Aileen and her brother grew up in an environment where love was scarce and punishment was frequent. By the time she reached her early teens, Aileen was already displaying troubling behaviors. She began drinking, using drugs, and getting into fights. She also began engaging in sexual activity at an early age, often in exchange for cigarettes, food, or money. She was only 11 when she started doing this with boys in the neighborhood, and soon she was ostracized at school and branded with a cruel reputation. At the age of 14, Aileen became pregnant after being raped by a family friend. Her grandfather forced her to give birth in a home for unwed mothers, and the child was immediately put up for adoption. She never saw the baby. Shortly afterward, her grandmother died, and her grandfather kicked her out of the house. By the time she was 15, she was homeless, surviving by hitchhiking, stealing, and engaging in prostitution along highways and truck stops. These years hardened Aileen. She drifted across the country, living on the margins of society. She was arrested several times for disorderly conduct, theft, and sex work. In her 20s, she moved to Florida, where the climate and roadside culture suited her transient lifestyle. She lived mostly out of cheap motels, with little stability, relying on prostitution to survive. In 1976, Aileen married a 69-year-old man named Louis Fell, who was a wealthy yacht club president. The marriage lasted only a matter of weeks before it dissolved in chaos. Aileen was volatile and quick to anger. She fought with Fell and was arrested for assault. The marriage ended quickly, and she returned to her wandering existence. Her brother Keith died of cancer in 1976 as well, leaving her with no close family. She received a small life insurance payout from his death, which she quickly spent. Over the following decade, Aileen was arrested repeatedly for offenses ranging from armed robbery to car theft. Police knew her as a drifter who lived by her wits, scraping by through sex work, scams, and petty crime. She spent short stints in jail, but never stayed long in one place. Her life was a constant cycle of brief highs and crushing lows. By the late 1980s, she was living in Florida full-time, working the highways as a prostitute. It was there she met a woman named Tyria Moore, a hotel maid. The two began a romantic relationship, and Aileen became deeply attached to her. For the first time in her life, she felt she had someone who cared about her. The two moved in together, living in cheap motels and apartments, surviving on Aileen's earnings from prostitution. Aileen was fiercely protective of Tyria and wanted to provide for her, but their life together was built on unstable ground. In late 1989, Aileen's life took a darker turn. She began killing the men who picked her up. Her first known victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics store owner. In November 1989, he picked up Aileen on a highway. Later, she claimed he had raped and beaten her, and that she killed him in self-defense. His body was found in the woods with multiple gunshot wounds. His car was later discovered abandoned. Over the next year, Aileen killed at least 6 more men. They were Charles Carskadden, David Spears, Peter Seams, Troy Burress, Charles Humphreys, and Walter Antonio. Each was shot multiple times with a .22 caliber pistol, and their bodies were dumped in wooded areas along highways. Their cars were stolen and sometimes abandoned or crashed. Aileen and Tyria were often seen driving the vehicles, which drew suspicion. The killings created fear across Florida as police struggled to identify a pattern. At first, the victims seemed unconnected, ranging in age and occupation. But ballistics evidence soon linked them together. Investigators realized a single female prostitute was likely involved. Witnesses reported seeing Aileen and Tyria together near several of the crime scenes. By late 1990, police had identified Aileen Wuornos as a suspect. They launched a manhunt, and in January 1991, Aileen was arrested at a biker bar in Volusia County. Tyria, fearing prosecution, agreed to cooperate with authorities. She called Aileen while wired by police and persuaded her to confess. Aileen admitted to the killings, but insisted they were all in self-defense, that the men had tried to rape or harm her. Her trial began in 1992 for the murder of Richard Mallory. Prosecutors painted her as a cold-blooded serial killer who preyed on men for money and cars. The defense argued that she was a traumatized woman who had been assaulted and was defending herself. But the evidence was overwhelming. Ballistics matched her gun to the murders. Witnesses placed her with the victims' vehicles, and her taped confession revealed contradictions. Aileen was convicted of Mallory's murder and sentenced to death. Over the next year, she was tried and convicted for several of the other murders, receiving 6 death sentences in total. She became one of the few women on Florida's death row, and the press quickly labeled her as the first female serial killer in modern American history. While in prison, Aileen's mental health deteriorated. She gave erratic interviews, sometimes expressing remorse, other times lashing out at the world. She accused prison staff of mistreating her and claimed conspiracies were being formed against her. She said she wanted to die, that she was tired of life and ready for execution. In October 2002, after more than a decade on death row, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old. Her final words were haunting. She said she would be back like Independence Day with Jesus and the spaceship. Her statements reflected the troubled and paranoid state of her mind at the end. The aftermath of her case left a complicated legacy. Some saw her as a monster who killed innocent men in cold blood. Others viewed her as a tragic figure, a woman brutalized from childhood who lashed out violently in a world that had never shown her kindness. Her life and crimes inspired documentaries, books, and the Oscar-winning film Monster, which portrayed her story with stark brutality. The story of Aileen Wuornos is not just about murder. It is also about cycles of abuse, trauma, and survival. From her abandoned childhood to her violent adulthood, every stage of her life seemed marked by cruelty and despair. In the end, she became both victim and predator, a woman who never found peace and left behind a trail of destruction. Edward Theodore Gain was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse, Wisconsin. He was the second son of George and Augusta Gain. The Gain family lived a life of isolation and dysfunction. His father, George, was an alcoholic who struggled to hold jobs, often working as a tanner or carpenter, but rarely staying employed for long. His mother, Augusta, was the dominant figure in the household. She was a strict, fanatically religious woman who instilled in her children a deep fear of sin, women, and the outside world. Augusta preached that the world was evil, filled with temptations of the flesh, and that women other than herself were instruments of sin and corruption. She raised Ed and his older brother Henry to believe that lust and desire were the work of the devil. Despite her cruelty and constant preaching, Ed adored his mother and saw her as the guiding force of his life. In 1914, the family moved to a small farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin. The farm was isolated, away from town, and Augusta liked it that way. She wanted to keep her boys away from the corrupting influence of the outside world. Ed grew up with little social interaction. He attended school, but was shy, withdrawn, and often the target of bullies. He had a peculiar manner of speaking and an unusual laugh, which made him stand out. His teachers noted that while he was quiet, he did fairly well academically, especially in reading. At home, Ed spent most of his time doing chores and listening to his mother's endless sermons. She read to him from the Bible, often focusing on passages about death, divine punishment, and the wickedness of women. This upbringing shaped Ed's worldview, blurring the lines between morality, sin, and obsession. As Ed grew into adolescence, his attachment to his mother deepened. He had almost no friends and no romantic relationships. He spent time reading pulp magazines about death, cannibals, and Nazi medical experiments. The grotesque fascinated him, and he began developing an unhealthy curiosity about the human body. In 1940, when Ed was 34, his father George died from heart failure, leaving Ed and Henry under the control of Augusta. The brothers worked odd jobs around town, often doing handyman tasks and farm work. Both were known as reliable workers, though Ed's strange mannerisms made him stand out. Henry, the older brother, eventually began to criticize Augusta's teachings and Ed's devotion to her. He worried about Ed's unhealthy attachment and often told friends that his brother's relationship with their mother was unnatural. In 1944, a mysterious event occurred. While the brothers were burning brush on the farm, the fire got out of control. Firefighters arrived, and when the blaze was put out, Ed claimed he had lost track of Henry. Later, Henry's body was found face down in the marsh. There were bruises on his head, and some suspected foul play, but the death was ruled as accidental. To this day, many believe Ed killed his brother to have his mother's love to himself. In 1945, tragedy struck again when Augusta suffered a series of strokes and died in December. Her death devastated Ed. She had been his entire world, and without her, he was utterly alone. He kept the farmhouse, but closed off most of the rooms, leaving them as shrines to his mother. He lived in a small area near the kitchen, surrounded by filth, decay, and growing madness. It was after his mother's death that Ed's behavior grew darker. He became fascinated with the idea of resurrection and the female body. He began visiting local cemeteries at night, exhuming the corpses of recently buried women who reminded him of his mother. He took their bodies home, dissected them, and used their skin and bones to create macabre trophies. Ed fashioned masks from human skin, belts made from nipples, bowls made from skulls, and even a suit of skin that he could wear. The small town of Plainfield had no idea of the horrors inside the Gain farmhouse. Ed remained a quiet but odd figure, sometimes babysitting local children, running errands, or doing handyman jobs. To many, he seemed harmless, just eccentric. That illusion shattered on November 16, 1957. Bernice Wardens, the owner of a local hardware store, went missing. Her son, who was the deputy sheriff, discovered bloodstains in the store and realized something was terribly wrong. The last sales receipt in the register showed that Bernice had sold antifreeze to Ed Gain. Police went to the Gain farmhouse to question him. What they found inside became one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American history. Inside the farmhouse, officers discovered Bernice Warden's body hanging upside down from the rafters. She had been shot with a rifle, decapitated and gutted like a deer. The scene shocked even the most hardened investigators. As they searched further, they uncovered Ed's gruesome collection. Chairs upholstered with human skin, masks made from faces, a lampshade made of flesh, boxes of bones, and clothing sewn from the remains of women. The farmhouse was a house of horrors, filled with evidence of years of grave robbing and murder. Ed confessed to killing Bernice Wardens and another local woman, Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who had vanished in 1954. He admitted to exhuming numerous graves, stealing bodies, and experimenting with their remains. He said he wanted to create a suit of skin to become his mother, believing he could resurrect her spirit by wearing the flesh of other women. The public was horrified. The crimes of Ed Gain became national news, both for their grotesque nature and their psychological depth. The quiet, reclusive farmhand had been living in a nightmare world of death and delusion, right under the noses of his unsuspecting neighbors. Ed was declared legally insane and unfit for trial. He was committed to a mental institution where he remained for the rest of his life. Decades later, in 1968, he was found fit to stand trial for the murder of Bernice Wardens. He was convicted but found insane at the time of the crime and was again confined to psychiatric care. Ed Gain spent his remaining years in institutions, often described as a quiet, compliant patient. He died on July 26, 1984, at the age of 77, from respiratory and heart failure due to cancer. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery, not far from the graves he had once disturbed. The legacy of Ed Gein lived on long after his death. His crimes inspired some of the most famous fictional killers in American culture, from Norman Bates in Psycho to Leatherface in Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. The story of the Butcher of Plainfield continues to haunt true crime history, a chilling reminder of how isolation, obsession, and madness can breed horrors that defy imagination. Next story. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9th of 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, the oldest of four brothers. His parents, William and Dorothea Rader, both worked long hours, leaving Dennis and his siblings often unattended. From an early age, Dennis felt neglected and unnoticed, something he would later point to as a seed for his need for control and recognition. As a boy, he developed disturbing habits. He tortured and killed small animals in secret, deriving a sense of power from their suffering. He also developed violent sexual fantasies, imagining women bound and helpless. These fantasies would grow more elaborate as he aged, laying the foundation for his crimes. Rader attended Riverview Elementary and later Wichita Heights High School. He was quiet, average in grades, and never stood out much. His peers recalled him as somewhat strange, withdrawn, and socially awkward. After graduation in 1963, he drifted through a few years of college, then enlisted in the Air Force, where he served until 1970. He was stationed overseas and later returned home with an honorable discharge. On the surface, he had matured into a disciplined man, but his secret fantasies had only deepened. In 1971, he married Paula Dietz, a woman from Kansas. Together, they built a seemingly normal suburban life. Rader worked various jobs, studied criminal justice at Wichita State University, and was active in his church. Neighbors saw him as responsible, even dull, a man who kept his lawn tidy and waved politely. What no one knew was that Rader had begun to live a double life. On January 15th of 1974, Dennis Rader carried out his first known murders. He targeted the Otero family in Wichita. That morning, he broke into their home armed with a pistol and his so-called hit kit, a collection of ropes, cords, and tools he had assembled. Inside were Joseph and Julie Otero, along with their children Joseph Jr. and Josephine. Rader bound them with cords, tightening control as he went. He strangled Joseph and Julie, then their son. Finally, he hanged Josephine from a basement pipe, later admitting that he derived sexual gratification from her death. When he left, four members of the Otero family lay dead. Their bodies were discovered by the two older Otero children when they returned from school. The murders shocked Wichita and launched an investigation, but no suspects were identified. Rader craved recognition. In the months after the Otero killings, he sent a letter to a local newspaper describing the crime in detail and taunting police for their failure to catch him. In the letter, he gave himself a name, BTK, which stood for bind, torture, kill. The name would become forever linked to his reign of terror. Over the next several years, Rader killed again. In April of 1974, he murdered Catherine Bright, a young woman he had followed. He broke into her home, attacked her and her brother, and stabbed Catherine multiple times. Her brother barely survived. In 1977, he killed Shirley Vian, a mother of three, after breaking into her home while her children were present. Later that year, he murdered Nancy Fox, binding and strangling her in her home. With each crime, he grew bolder, sending letters to police and media that detailed his fantasies and mocked the investigation. His communications often included cryptic drawings, poems, and codes, as though he were playing a twisted game. Despite the brutality of the murders, Rader was careful. He wore gloves, planned his attacks, and chose victims after stalking them. He referred to them as projects, reducing human lives to objects for his gratification. For police, the lack of clear evidence and the randomness of victims made the case difficult. Wichita lived in fear. Women checked their locks constantly, and rumors spread about the faceless killer who seemed to strike at will. In 1985, after several years of silence, BTK resurfaced with the murder of Maureen Hedge, a neighbor who lived only a few houses away from Rader. He broke into her home, strangled her, and then transported her body to his church, where he posed her in disturbing ways before discarding her in the countryside. This act showed how his fantasies and his public life were intertwined in ways no one could imagine. Rader continued killing into the late 1980s and early 1990s. In 1986, he murdered Vicki Wegerle, strangling her in her home and photographing her body. In 1991, his final known victim, Dolores Davis, was abducted from her home, killed, and hidden beneath a bridge. After this, Rader appeared to stop killing, focusing instead on his family, career, and church duties. By the 1990s, the BTK case had gone cold. Police had files of letters, crime scene evidence, and victim accounts, but no suspect. Rader blended seamlessly into society. He became a compliance officer in Park City, enforcing local codes with strictness that annoyed many residents. He was also president of his church council, deeply involved in community affairs. To all appearances, he was a model citizen. Behind the mask, he continued to indulge in his fantasies, dressing in women's clothing, binding himself with ropes, and taking photographs of himself in elaborate poses meant to recreate the murders. The break in the case came not from police detective work alone, but from Rader's own arrogance. In 2004, after years of silence, he began sending letters again. He craved the attention he once had and wanted credit for his crimes. He mailed packages to local media, including a floppy disk with a message. Rader believed he had erased all traces of identity from the disk, but digital forensics revealed otherwise. Metadata on the file led police directly to the Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita, where the file had been saved under the name Dennis. Investigators quickly connected Dennis Rader, the church council president, to the BTK case. Rader was placed under surveillance, and DNA obtained from his daughter's medical records matched DNA found at BTK crime scenes. In February 2005, after more than 30 years of mystery, Dennis Rader was arrested. The arrest shocked the community. People who had known him for decades could not believe that the polite church man and strict code enforcer was the same person who had terrorized Wichita. Rader confessed in chilling detail, describing each murder as though he were recounting a work project. He showed no remorse, instead speaking matter-of-factly about how he stalked, bound, and killed his victims. He explained that he was driven by an alter ego he called Factor X, a dark force that compelled him. In court, Rader pled guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. During his sentencing in August 2005, he gave a long statement describing each crime, again in detached detail. Family members of the victims wept as they listened. The judge sentenced him to 10 consecutive life terms with no possibility of parole. Rader was sent to El Dorado Correctional Facility, where he remains to this day. The case of the BTK killer stands as one of the most disturbing examples of a double life in criminal history. For 30 years, Dennis Rader was a husband, father, church leader, and community official. At the same time, he was a sadistic murderer who bound, tortured, and killed 10 people, reveling in the terror he caused. His arrogance in seeking attention ultimately led to his capture, ending decades of fear in Wichita. The story of BTK is a reminder of the masks people can wear and of how evil can hide behind the most ordinary of faces. David Berkowitz entered the world on June 1st, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York. He was born as Richard David Falco, the illegitimate child of Elizabeth Broder and Joseph Kleinman. His father was already married to another woman, and his mother was struggling financially and emotionally. Within just a few days of his birth, she gave him up for adoption. The infant boy was taken in by Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, a middle-class Jewish couple who lived in the Bronx. They renamed him David Richard Berkowitz. For the first years of his life, it seemed like he would grow up in a stable home. His adoptive parents doted on him, but inside, David carried feelings of abandonment that would never go away. Growing up, David was restless and troubled. He had difficulty concentrating in school, often lashed out at other children, and developed an early fascination with destruction. One of the first signs of his darker impulses was his obsession with fire. Even as a child, he was caught setting small fires in trash cans and vacant lots. The thrill of watching flames spread gave him a sense of power and control. As he grew older, this obsession escalated. Investigators later discovered that during his adolescence, he may have set more than 1,000 separate fires across New York City, meticulously documenting them in notebooks. This compulsion foreshadowed the compulsive violence that would later define his adult life. Tragedy struck when David was just 14. His adoptive mother, Pearl, who had been the center of his emotional world, died of breast cancer. The loss shattered him. His father, Nathan, soon remarried, but David rejected his stepmother. The home felt cold, and the teenager spiraled further into isolation. He became angry, rebellious, and distant. He wandered the streets late at night, broke into houses, vandalized property, and nurtured violent fantasies. Teachers described him as disruptive and emotionally unstable. Neighbors noticed his odd behavior and tendency to lash out unpredictably. David began to feel like an outsider, unwanted in school, unwanted at home, and fundamentally disconnected from everyone around him. At 18, desperate for structure and a new sense of identity, David enlisted in the United States Army. Military life gave him discipline and routine, and he trained as a marksman, learning to handle firearms with precision. He was stationed in South Korea during his service, where he became proficient with rifles and pistols. But despite the opportunities to build camaraderie, David remained withdrawn. He struggled to form friendships and continued to feel like an outcast. In 1974, after 3 years of service, he was honorably discharged and returned to New York City. Back in civilian life, David worked a series of low-paying jobs, including security guard positions and later as a postal worker. He lived alone in Yonkers, and his mental state began to unravel. He developed strange fixations and paranoid delusions. One of the most disturbing centered on his neighbor Sam Carr, a man who owned a black Labrador retriever. David became convinced that the dog was possessed by a demon and was transmitting orders from Satan, commanding him to kill. The delusion grew more elaborate until David believed he was the soldier of a vast satanic network. By 1976, these thoughts became unbearable, and he decided to act on them. The killing spree began on Christmas Eve of 1975. David attacked 2 young women, stabbing them in Co-op City in the Bronx. Both survived, but the assaults gave him his first taste of the violence he craved. Months later, he escalated to gunfire. On July 29, 1976, he approached 2 women sitting in a parked car in the Bronx, Donna Loria and Jody Valenti. Without warning, he pulled out a .44 caliber revolver and fired. Donna was killed instantly, and Jody was wounded. The brutality shocked the neighborhood, but at first, police considered it an isolated act. Over the next year, the shootings continued. On October 23, 1976, Carl DeNaro and Rosemary Keenan were attacked while sitting in a car in Queens. Both survived, though Carl was seriously injured. In November, high school students Donna DeMazy and Joan Lomino were shot in Queens. Donna was wounded, and Joan was left permanently paralyzed. On January 30th, 1977, David struck again, killing Christine Freund as she sat in a car with her fiancé, John Deal. The randomness of the attacks terrified New Yorkers. The killer seemed to target young women with long brown hair, often couples sitting in parked cars late at night. As the months went by, the list of victims grew. In March, Virginia Voskerikian, a 20-year-old student, was gunned down on her way home from class. In April, Valentina Suriani and her boyfriend Alexander Esau were shot in the Bronx. Both died from their wounds. By this point, police began to suspect that a single gunman was behind the series of attacks. Ballistic tests revealed that the bullets came from the same .44 caliber revolver. Newspapers seized on the story, and panic spread throughout the city. Women died or cut their hair to avoid fitting the killer's apparent preference. Couples avoided parking in lovers' lanes. Nightlife across the boroughs slowed. The fear of the unknown gunman seeped into daily life. David Berkowitz, meanwhile, reveled in the attention. He wrote taunting letters to the police and the press, signing himself as the Son of Sam. In these rambling notes, he described himself as a monster under the command of a demonic father figure. The letters were published in newspapers, and his words fueled hysteria. He enjoyed watching the city tremble. The killings continued into the summer of 1977. In June, Judy Placido and Salvatore Lupo were shot in Queens after leaving a nightclub, though both survived. On July 31st, David carried out his final attack, killing 20-year-old Stacy Moskowitz and blinding her date, Robert Violante, in Brooklyn. It was this attack that ultimately led to his capture. Witnesses reported seeing a man near the crime scene, carrying something under his arm. A woman noticed a suspicious figure tearing up a parking ticket on his car near the shooting site. Investigators traced the ticket to a Ford Galaxy registered to David Berkowitz in Yonkers. On August 10, 1977, police surrounded his apartment building. Inside his car, they found a rifle, maps of past crime scenes, and a letter threatening future attacks. When they knocked on his door, David reportedly greeted them calmly, saying, "You got me." In custody, Berkowitz confessed to the shootings. He claimed that he was obeying commands from a demon who spoke through Sam Carr's dog. Although these claims raised questions about his sanity, he was declared competent to stand trial. To avoid the death penalty, David pled guilty to 6 murders and was sentenced to 6 life terms in prison. Behind bars, Berkowitz initially embraced his notoriety. He gave interviews and fueled myths about his involvement in satanic cults. In the late 1980s, he claimed to have undergone a religious conversion, declaring himself a born-again Christian. Over the decades, he has remained in prison, occasionally speaking to the media, but never leaving the confines of his cell. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer remains one of the darkest chapters in modern crime history. Born in May 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Jeffrey grew up in a home that was outwardly normal but internally fractured. His father, Lionel, was a research chemist, and his mother, Joyce, battled her own struggles with mental health. From a young age, Jeffrey displayed signs of detachment from those around him. He was shy, withdrawn, and often preferred to be alone. What stood out to those who later reflected on his youth was a fascination with the dead and with animals in particular. Jeffrey would collect roadkill, study the bodies, and experiment with their bones. At the time, these habits were dismissed as odd, but not alarming enough to demand intervention. As Jeffrey entered his teenage years, his isolation deepened. Alcohol became his companion. He began drinking heavily, even during school hours, hiding liquor in the folds of his clothing or stashing it in lockers. His classmates sometimes laughed about it, but his drinking was a symptom of a deeper emptiness that was consuming him. He felt disconnected from people. At the same time, Jeffrey was beginning to struggle with his own sexual identity, and he later admitted that his urges were mixed with fantasies of control and domination. The pivotal moment that marked his first descent into murder came in June 1978, shortly after his high school graduation. His parents had separated, and Jeffrey was left alone in the family home. One evening, he picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. Stephen was a young man heading to a rock concert, and he accepted Jeffrey's invitation to stop at the house for some drinks. At first, the atmosphere was friendly, but as the night wore on, Jeffrey realized that Stephen wanted to leave. Panic and desperation filled him because Jeffrey did not want to be alone again. He struck Stephen with a dumbbell and strangled him. This was the first murder. Afterward, Jeffrey dismembered the body and disposed of it in the woods behind the house. This act haunted him, but it also awakened something inside him that he would later admit he could not control. In the years that followed, Jeffrey tried to appear normal. He briefly attended Ohio State University, but dropped out after only a few months. His drinking worsened, and his father forced him to enlist in the Army in 1979. Jeffrey trained as a medic in Germany. While stationed overseas, he continued to drink excessively. Some later reports suggested that he may have assaulted fellow soldiers, though these cases were never pursued in detail at the time. By 1981, he was discharged for his inability to function. With no stable direction, Jeffrey drifted between relatives and odd jobs. By the late 1980s, his impulses returned stronger. Living in Milwaukee in a small apartment, Jeffrey began frequenting gay bars and bathhouses. At first, he sought companionship, but his fear of abandonment twisted these encounters. He started drugging men to keep them unconscious during their encounters. Eventually, this progressed into murder once again. In 1987, he killed Stephen Twomey in a hotel room after a night of drinking. Jeffrey later claimed he awoke to find Stephen dead without memory of killing him, but this pattern of blackout, followed by violence, would repeat. Over the next 4 years, Dahmer embarked on a spree that would claim 16 more lives. His method was chillingly systematic. He lured young men and boys, often from marginalized communities, with promises of money or photographs. Once inside his apartment, he drugged them, strangled them, and kept their bodies for days. In some cases, he performed disturbing rituals of dismemberment and cannibalism. He kept skulls and body parts as trophies, storing them in his refrigerator in a blue barrel filled with acid. His obsession was not only with killing, but with creating a permanent companion who could never leave him. He attempted crude experiments of drilling holes into the skulls of victims and injecting chemicals in hopes of creating a compliant zombie-like partner. Despite the horror unfolding inside his apartment, Jeffrey remained surprisingly unnoticed. Several near escapes highlight the tragic failures of authorities. One of the most striking occurred in May 1991 when a 14-year-old boy named Konarak, Synthesum phone, managed to flee Jeffrey's apartment drugged and bleeding. Neighbors called police when they saw the boy wandering incoherently. Officers arrived, but Jeffrey convinced them that Konarak was his adult lover and that it was a private matter. The police accepted this explanation and left the boy in Jeffrey's custody. Within an hour, Jeffrey had killed him. These failures allowed Dahmer to continue his crimes until July 22nd, 1991, when another intended victim, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape. Edwards was lured to the apartment, but once inside, he noticed the smell and saw the strange surroundings. Jeffrey attempted to handcuff him, but Edwards fought back and fled through the door. He stopped police officers on patrol and led them back to the apartment. When police entered, they discovered photographs of dismembered bodies, and soon after, the full extent of Jeffrey's actions was revealed. The arrest shocked the nation. Neighbors who had complained of foul smells and odd noises were horrified to learn what had been happening next door. The investigation uncovered remains of multiple victims, as well as the tools and containers Jeffrey had used. His calm demeanor during questioning unsettled investigators. He openly admitted to the murders, describing his rituals in clinical detail. For the families of the victims, the revelations were devastating. Many of them were already living in difficult social and economic circumstances and now had to endure the public exposure of their loved ones' deaths. The trial began in January 1992 and drew international attention. Jeffrey pleaded guilty but insane. His defense argued that his mental illness drove his uncontrollable urges. The prosecution maintained that he knew exactly what he was doing and that he carefully planned his actions. After weeks of testimony, including graphic evidence, the jury found him guilty on 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms totaling nearly 1,000 years in prison. Prison did not bring peace. Jeffrey initially lived quietly behind bars, reading the Bible and speaking to chaplains. Yet other inmates viewed him with contempt. He sometimes mocked guards and prisoners by shaping his food into body parts, as if to relive his crimes. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was attacked by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver. Scarver beat him to death in the prison bathroom. For many families, this ending felt like a final chapter, though it could never erase the pain. The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer continues to stir debates about mental illness policing and the vulnerability of marginalized groups. His crimes revealed systemic failures in law enforcement, who dismissed the concerns of neighbors and ignored the pleas of victims. It showed how predators can hide in plain sight, while institutions fail to protect those most at risk. Documentaries and books continue to analyze the case, but beyond the sensationalism lies the human cost. 17 lives were lost, each with families who still mourn. Story 2. Ted Bundy remains a name etched into the darkest pages of criminal history. Born in November 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, Theodore Robert Bundy grew up in an environment of secrets. His mother, Eleanor, raised him with the support of her strict parents. For a time, Ted believed his grandparents were his parents, and his mother was his sister. The truth of his parentage remained confusing, and he grew up with an undercurrent of instability. Despite this, outwardly, he appeared intelligent, polite, and even charming. As a young boy, Bundy displayed early signs of detachment and fascination with control. Neighbors recalled that he sometimes placed knives around his aunt as she slept. He also developed a habit of peeping into windows and stealing items from homes. Still, these warning signs went largely unnoticed. He was a good student and seemed socially adept. Teachers saw him as quiet and well-mannered. In the 1960s, Bundy attended the University of Washington in Seattle. There he studied psychology and became politically active, volunteering for campaigns and working a crisis hotline. Colleagues at the hotline would later recall his calm voice and apparent empathy for callers in distress. Nobody suspected that he was already harboring violent fantasies. Bundy's murders began in the early 1970s, though it is believed he may have killed earlier. He targeted young women, often students who resembled a former girlfriend he felt deeply rejected by. He would approach them in public places pretending to be injured or in need of help. Sometimes he wore a sling or used crutches. When kind strangers offered assistance, he would lead them to a secluded area and attack. His earliest confirmed victims were in Washington state. In 1974, a series of disappearances began to alarm police. Women vanished from college campuses, leaving little trace. One of the first was Linda, an Healy student at the University of Washington who disappeared from her home in January 1974. That summer, two women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, disappeared on the same day from Lake Sammamish State Park. Witnesses described a handsome man with a cast on his arm asking women to help him load a sailboat. He introduced himself as Ted. This was one of the first times investigators had a name. Bundy's ability to charm and deceive allowed him to evade suspicion. He continued his studies, even attending law school. Outwardly, he dated women, maintained friendships, and volunteered in politics. Yet beneath this mask, his killings escalated. He abducted, raped, and murdered women across multiple states, including Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. His method was consistent. He lured victims often at night, assaulted them, and killed them usually by strangulation or bludgeoning. He sometimes revisited the bodies, leaving them in remote wooded areas, and in some cases committing acts of necrophilia. By 1975, Bundy had moved to Utah, and killings began there as well. Local investigators grew alarmed at the pattern. He was eventually arrested that year after police found burglary tools in his car, which also contained suspicious items like handcuffs and a ski mask. At the time, this evidence was not enough for a murder charge, but it marked the beginning of his downfall. Bundy managed to escape custody multiple times, which only added to his infamy. In 1977, while held in Colorado, he leapt from a courthouse library window and fled. He was recaptured, but later that year, he escaped again from his jail cell by squeezing through a hole in the ceiling. He made his way across the country to Florida. In Florida, Bundy unleashed his most brutal attacks. In January 1978, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. In the early hours of the morning, he attacked 4 women in their rooms, killing 2 of them, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, and severely injuring the others. Only weeks later, he abducted and murdered a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach. These crimes shocked the nation and ended any illusion that Bundy was a man who could restrain himself. His capture came soon after. In February 1978, he was pulled over by police in Pensacola driving a stolen car. Once identified, his face was splashed across newspapers nationwide. The trial that followed was the first to be televised, and millions watched as Bundy attempted to defend himself in court. He cross-examined witnesses and played the role of his own lawyer. His charm and arrogance fascinated the media, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Bite mark analysis tied him to the Chi Omega murders, and witnesses placed him near the scenes. In 1979, Bundy was convicted and sentenced to death. Additional trials followed for the murder of Kimberly Leach, and he received another death sentence. Over the next decade, he lived on death row in Florida, appealing his case and granting interviews. During this time, he confessed to more than 30 murders, though investigators believe the true number may be higher, possibly over 100. Bundy described in chilling detail how he selected and killed his victims. In January 1989, his appeals ran out, and he was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Outside, the prison crowds gathered, chanting and celebrating the end of his life. For many families, the execution closed a painful chapter, though the scars of loss remained. The legacy of Ted Bundy endures because his crimes revealed how easily appearances can deceive. He was educated, articulate, and outwardly normal, yet beneath that facade lay a predator driven by compulsion. His case led to greater awareness of a need for coordinated police work across states, since Bundy moved freely between jurisdictions. It also highlighted the vulnerability of young women who trusted a stranger in need. Today, Bundy is remembered not only for his crimes, but also for the way society responded to him. The media often portrayed him as charismatic, which drew criticism for humanizing him instead of focusing on the victims. Books, documentaries, and films continue to analyze his life, but at the core remain the stories of the women whose lives were stolen. They were daughters, sisters, and friends who deserve remembrance beyond the shadow of the man who killed them. Bundy's story is one of deception, manipulation, and cruelty wrapped in the mask of normalcy. It endures as a warning that evil can sometimes wear the most ordinary face. Story 3. John Wayne Gacy was born in March 1942 in Chicago, Illinois. He grew up in a working-class family with a father who was an alcoholic and physically abusive. His childhood was marked by fear and insecurity. Though he tried to please his father, nothing ever seemed enough. He suffered from health problems, including a heart condition that limited his activities. These early years shaped a man who longed for acceptance, but carried deep resentment and anger inside. Despite a difficult home life, Gacy worked hard to present himself as normal. In high school, he was not particularly athletic, but he participated in clubs and worked odd jobs. He developed an early interest in politics and community activities. After leaving school, he married and tried to build a stable life. For a time, he seemed successful. He managed several fast food restaurants and became involved in local organizations. His outward personality was friendly and generous. He hosted neighborhood gatherings and was known to dress as a clown named Pogo to entertain children at hospitals and community events. This image of the cheerful neighbor and community volunteer would later stand in sharp contrast to the darkness he hid. Beneath the mask of normalcy, Gacy was leading a double life. He had already faced accusations of assaulting young men in the 1960s while living in Iowa. He was convicted of sexually abusing a teenage boy in 1968 and sentenced to prison. Though he served less than 2 years, he returned to Chicago with a record that should have been a warning. Instead, he managed to rebuild his reputation. He remarried, started his own construction business, and became active in local politics. He was even photographed with prominent politicians. To the public, he was a respected businessman. To those closest to him, there were glimpses of volatility, but few suspected the horror that lay hidden. Gacy's crimes escalated in the early 1970s. He lured young men and boys to his home, often offering them work construction jobs or simply a safe place to hang out. Once inside his modest suburban house, he would overpower them. His method became ritualistic. He used handcuffs, sometimes presenting them as a party trick. After restraining his victims, he would assault, torture, and eventually strangle them. Most of the killings took place in his home while his neighbors remained unaware. The number of victims grew over the years. Gacy buried many of them in the crawl space beneath his house. Others were disposed of in nearby rivers. The smell in the house became overwhelming at times, but Gacy explained it away as plumbing issues. He continued to maintain his outward image of normality, attending parties, working in politics, and performing as Pogo the Clown. The juxtaposition between his community role and his secret life made the eventual revelation all the more shocking. In 1978, his crimes began to unravel. That December, a teenage boy named Robert Pius disappeared after telling friends he was going to meet a contractor about a job. The contractor was John Wayne Gacy. When police began investigating, they quickly connected Gacy to other missing young men. They obtained a search warrant and entered his house. Inside, they found items that belonged to several missing victims. The stench from the crawl space raised immediate suspicions. A second search warrant allowed police to dig beneath the house. What they uncovered was a nightmare. Body after body was exhumed from the crawl space. In total, 29 victims were buried there, with additional remains found in rivers nearby. Many of the victims were teenagers or young men who had simply vanished without explanation. For families who had searched desperately for answers, the discovery was devastating. Gacy was arrested and interrogated. His demeanor shocked investigators. He confessed calmly to more than 30 murders, describing his methods in chilling detail. He admitted that he had sometimes killed 2 victims in a single night. He spoke of the killings as though they were routine parts of his life. His lack of remorse and the sheer scale of his crimes stunned even seasoned detectives. The trial of John Wayne Gacy began in 1980. It attracted enormous attention. Prosecutors laid out the evidence of his double life and the brutality of his murders. The defense attempted to argue insanity, but the jury was unconvinced. The calculated nature of his crimes and his ability to maintain a normal outward life demonstrated that he understood his actions. After only a short deliberation, the jury found him guilty on 33 counts of murder. It was one of the largest conviction totals for a single person in American history at the time. Gacy was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center in Illinois. During this time, he painted hundreds of portraits, many of them depicting clowns. These paintings were sometimes sold at auctions, sparking controversy. Gacy gave interviews in which he denied responsibility despite his earlier confessions. He claimed he was the victim of a conspiracy. His shifting stories only added to his notoriety. On May 10th, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Outside, the prison crowds gathered in celebration. For many families, the execution brought some closure, though nothing could restore the lives that were lost. The sheer scale of his crimes left a permanent scar on the communities he had haunted. The case of John Wayne Gacy continues to resonate because of the contrast between his public and private lives. He was the friendly neighbor, the businessman, the clown who entertained children, yet behind closed doors, he was a predator who murdered more than 30 young men. His ability to hide in plain sight exposed flaws in the system and highlighted how vulnerable runaway teens and young workers were in the 1970s. The legacy of Gacy is one of horror and deception. His crimes serve as a reminder that appearances can be misleading and that predators can exist even in the most ordinary neighborhoods. The memory of his victims endures as a testament to lives cut short by a man who wore a mask, both literal and figurative. Behind the smile of a clown lay the heart of a killer. Story 4. The Zodiac Killer is a name that still casts a shadow over the history of American crime. Active in the late 1960s and early 1970s in Northern California, the Zodiac terrorized communities with brutal murders and cryptic letters. Unlike many other killers, his identity was never confirmed, which has only deepened the mystery and fear surrounding the case. The first confirmed attack attributed to the Zodiac occurred on December 20th, 1968, near the small town of Benicia, California. 2 teenagers, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, were on their first date when they parked at a lover's lane spot. A car pulled up beside them. The assailant forced them out and shot both of them with a handgun. Betty Lou died instantly, and David was mortally wounded. There was no robbery or clear motive. It seemed a senseless act. Investigators had few leads, and the case went cold. On July 4th, 1969, another couple, Darlene Farron and Mike Mageau, were sitting in a car at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo when a vehicle pulled up. The driver left, then returned and opened fire with a handgun. Darlene was killed, and Mike survived with serious injuries. Just over an hour later, a man called the Vallejo police station claiming responsibility not only for this attack, but also for the previous one on David and Betty Lou. The caller provided details that had not been released publicly. It was the first direct communication from the man who would call himself the Zodiac. Weeks later, newspapers received letters written by the killer. These letters were taunting, filled with strange symbols and coded messages. In one, he introduced himself with the chilling phrase, "This is the Zodiac speaking." He demanded that the letters be published or he would kill more people. Inside the letters were cryptograms that he claimed revealed his identity. One of the first ciphers was cracked by a schoolteacher and his wife. It did not reveal a name, but instead a disturbing message where the killer declared that he enjoyed killing because it was fun. The Zodiac struck again on September 27, 1969 at Lake Berryessa. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were relaxing by the water when a man approached wearing a hood with a crosshair symbol on the chest. He tied them up and stabbed them repeatedly. Brian survived, but Cecilia later died. Before leaving the scene, the attacker scrawled a message on the victim's car door with the dates of his previous attacks and his distinctive crosshair symbol. Only 2 weeks later, on October 11th, 1969, the Zodiac murdered cab driver Paul Stein in San Francisco. He shot him in the head and then bizarrely cut a piece of the victim's shirt to send later with a letter. Witnesses saw the killer at the scene, describing him as a white male in his 30s with glasses. Despite this near miss, the Zodiac managed to escape into the night. Police rushed to the area, but confusion about the suspect's race led officers to let him walk past them. This mistake may have cost them their best chance at capture. Over the following years, the Zodiac continued to send letters to newspapers and police. In them, he mocked investigators, boasted about his crimes, and threatened mass killings. He claimed responsibility for dozens of murders, though only a handful have been definitively linked to him. The letters often included ciphers, some of which remain unsolved to this day. His messages revealed a man who craved attention and control more than anything. He wanted to be feared and to prove that he was smarter than the authorities. The investigation into the Zodiac was massive. Police departments across multiple counties worked together, but cooperation was strained at times. Thousands of tips poured in, and hundreds of suspects were investigated. The most famous suspect was Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted child molester who lived in Vallejo and matched some descriptions. He was interviewed multiple times and even named in a search warrant. Circumstantial evidence pointed toward him, but definitive proof never surfaced. DNA analysis years later did not match him, though doubts and debates remain. As time passed, the Zodiac's letters grew less frequent. His last confirmed correspondence was in 1974. After that, the trail went cold. Some believe he died or was imprisoned for another crime. Others think he simply stopped writing and continued living quietly under a false identity. The lack of closure left victims' families and investigators frustrated. In the decades since the killings, the Zodiac has become part of American folklore. Books, documentaries, and films have kept the story alive. Amateur sleuths have dedicated their lives to decoding his ciphers and piecing together clues. In 2020, a team of codebreakers finally solved one of his unsolved ciphers sent in 1969. The message contained more taunts, but again, no name. This reinforced the idea that the Zodiac never intended to reveal his identity. His goal was to manipulate the public and instill fear. The impact of the Zodiac case was profound. It highlighted the challenges of interagency cooperation in the pre-digital era when communication between counties was slow. It showed how media attention could both aid and hinder investigations. The constant publication of his letters gave him the spotlight he desired, but also kept the public informed. To this day, the identity of the Zodiac remains unproven. DNA analysis offers some hope, but the evidence is limited and degraded by time. Theories abound, ranging from known suspects like Arthur Lee Allen to more obscure figures. Every few years, a new claim emerges about his identity, but none have been confirmed. The story of the Zodiac killer endures because it combines brutal violence with mystery. Unlike other serial killers who were eventually caught and exposed, the Zodiac remains a ghost figure lurking in the shadows of history. His victims were ordinary people, young couples enjoying evenings by the water, or a cab driver working late at night. Their lives were cut short by a man who wanted to be remembered for terror rather than for who he was. Today, more than 50 years later, the case continues to fascinate because it is unfinished. The unanswered questions leave space for endless speculation. The Zodiac's cryptic symbols remain as haunting reminders of a killer who manipulated fear with both weapons and words. His legacy is not only in the murders he committed, but in the way he exploited mystery itself, turning crime into a dark puzzle that is yet to be solved. Story 5. Richard Ramirez was born in February 1960 in El Paso, Texas. His childhood was marked by instability and violence. His father was strict and often abusive. His mother worked in a factory where exposure to chemicals may have affected her health. Richard grew up surrounded by poverty and dysfunction. From a young age, he was influenced by his older cousin Miguel, who had returned from serving in Vietnam. Miguel boasted about brutal acts he had committed during the war and even showed Richard disturbing photographs of women he claimed to have assaulted. At only 12 years old, Richard witnessed Miguel murder his own wife during a domestic argument. These traumatic experiences left deep scars on the boy who was already vulnerable. Richard began experimenting with drugs as a teenager, turning to marijuana and later LSD. He also developed a fascination with Satanism and dark rituals. He struggled in school and dropped out early. His petty crimes soon escalated into burglaries. By his early 20s, he had moved to California, drifting through Los Angeles and San Francisco, surviving on theft and immersing himself in a lifestyle of addiction and violence. His descent into murder began in 1984. That June, a 79-year-old woman named Jenny Vincow was found dead in her apartment in Los Angeles. She had been stabbed, and her body showed signs of mutilation. Police had no suspect at the time, but years later this crime was linked to Richard Ramirez. It marked the start of his killing spree. By 1985, the murders escalated dramatically. Ramirez gained the nickname the Night Stalker because he attacked in the middle of the night. He targeted homes across Southern California, breaking in while victims slept. His methods were unpredictable. Sometimes he used a gun, other times a knife or blunt objects. He killed men and women of all ages. He assaulted women and sometimes children. He left satanic symbols at crime scenes and forced victims to swear their loyalty to the devil. The randomness of his attacks created widespread fear because nobody knew who might be next. In March 1985, he attacked Maria Hernandez in her home in Rosemead. She survived by raising her hands and deflecting a bullet. Minutes later, he killed another woman, Tsai, Lianyu, outside her car nearby. That same evening, he killed a third woman in her apartment. These rapid attacks terrified the city. Newspapers began covering the Night Stalker daily. Over the next months, Ramirez continued his spree. He invaded homes across Los Angeles and beyond, often leaving survivors who could describe his appearance. He was tall, thin, with rotting teeth and a foul odor that witnesses never forgot. His brutality shocked even seasoned detectives. In some cases, he forced couples to witness each other's assaults before killing one or both. He showed no consistent pattern except his desire to terrorize. The police struggled to catch him. At first, the crime seemed unrelated because of the varying weapons and methods. But soon detectives connected the attacks by shoe prints left behind. A distinct sneaker pattern linked multiple scenes. The media reported on this detail, which angered investigators because Ramirez could have changed his shoes to avoid detection. Still, the clue remained vital. By the summer of 1985, his crimes reached a peak. He attacked in San Francisco, killing Peter and Barbara Pan in their home. The mayor of San Francisco publicly revealed that the killer used a .22 caliber handgun. Ramirez read the papers constantly and adjusted his tactics to confuse police. But mistakes piled up. Survivors gave detailed descriptions, and eventually a fingerprint was lifted from a stolen car he abandoned. Police matched it to Richard Ramirez, who already had a record for theft and drug charges. On August 31st, 1985, Ramirez was finally captured, but not by police at first. His photograph had been released to the public, and when he attempted to steal a car in East Los Angeles, he was recognized. Neighbors chased him through the streets and cornered him. The crowd beat him until police arrived to take him into custody. The capture brought relief to a city that had been living in fear for months. The trial of Richard Ramirez became one of the most notorious in American history. It began in 1989 and lasted over a year. The courtroom was often filled with reporters and curious spectators. Ramirez seemed to revel in the attention. He flashed satanic hand signs and shouted "Hail Satan" during proceedings. His gaunt appearance, dark eyes, and defiant attitude made him a figure of morbid fascination. Despite his behavior, the evidence was overwhelming. Survivors testified in detail. Forensic evidence, including fingerprints and ballistic matches, tied him to multiple murders. In September 1989, Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, as well as numerous counts of assault, burglary, and attempted murder. He was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin prison. Outside the courthouse, crowds cheered the verdict. Families of victims wept both in grief and in relief that justice had been served. On death row, Ramirez continued to attract media attention. He received letters from admirers and even married a woman who believed in his innocence. His presence remained unsettling. Unlike some killers who eventually expressed remorse, he showed none. He continued to speak about Satanism and portrayed himself as an outcast who had embraced evil. Ramirez never faced execution. He remained on death row for more than 2 decades. In June 2013, he died of complications related to cancer at the age of 53. For some, the fact that he died of natural causes rather than execution was frustrating, but his death finally closed the chapter on his life. The legacy of the Night Stalker remains one of pure terror. His crimes were random, cruel, and driven not by need, but by desire to spread fear. Unlike killers who targeted specific types of victims, Ramirez attacked anyone he encountered. This unpredictability magnified the panic in California communities. People began locking doors, installing new security systems, and staying awake at night terrified that he might strike. His story highlights the vulnerability of ordinary homes and the way one man can paralyze entire cities. The survivors of his attacks continue to carry the memories of those nights. The families of the dead live with the loss of loved ones whose lives were cut short in acts of senseless brutality. Richard Ramirez remains a reminder of the darkest extremes of human behavior. He called himself a servant of Satan, but in reality, he was a predator who preyed on the innocent. His name and the moniker Night Stalker endure in American memory as symbols of fear that once gripped a generation. Story 6. In the quiet rural town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, during the first half of the 20th century, life moved slowly and simply. The community